The 19th, 2021. There are quite a few matters on the agenda, some presentations. But the beginning, we must adopt the minutes of the meeting of October the 16th, 2020.
So moved.
Any discussion? All in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. That means at this point we have to move into a closed session because of the sensitive nature of some of the matters that are going to be discussed. And Ms. Campbell, under what section are we moving into the closed session this time?
Section 91K to discuss service negotiation.
To be here. It was a special rule that they created, which is really about how can Rogers do more with the network infrastructure.
We're now back in our regular meeting, and the next item on the agenda is a report on our strategic plan update. It'll be a verbal report from our CAO, Mr. Hildebrand.
Thank you, Chair Gillis. If we could pull that presentation up, that'd be great. As we're pulling up the presentation, I just wanted to make a few comments. I'm very pleased to be able to present our draft plan for the 2021-22 strategic plan. Colin O'Leary is on the Zoom call here, and he's going to join and help present the overview as well. These types of documents take a huge effort, and I'd like to thank our communications team, specifically Mike for the layout and the template, the entire senior management team, specifically Vicky did a lot of editing and went over and above to help me out with that, and of course all of you for your input and feedback, and I'm hoping to get some more today. So I'm happy with the draft, but certainly there are things that we have missed. There could be new ideas, wording changes, grammar. Thanks to Director Roden. I got an email this morning with some grammar and punctuation that I've made sure we follow up on. And so today we're going to do a short overview on the strat plan and the process, and then share the draft with you, which you've already had a chance to review. But most importantly, want to hear your feedback. So if you can, I'll just look to you. All right. So 2019, this team pulled together its first strat plan. It was made up of many priorities and actions, but from my humble opinion, lacked a few things, such as what we're really focusing on. There wasn't real clarity. How do our priorities link to our operational activities? How do we update and change priorities kind of on the fly in the middle of the term? How do we review and update the board or the progress and significant milestones, and how do we let the board know on a regular basis? And then finally, I feel it lacked a bit of luster, and that's why we wanted to change it up a bit. So the now and next that I think you might be familiar with, that process I think was good, but feel there may be a better way and certainly a more creative, engaging, and user-friendly way of communicating this. To talk about what is important to this board and the entire organization. Next, please. I'm going to pass it over to Colin. Colin, hopefully you can hear us now, and you can take it away from that page.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Scott. So we just want to take a really quick moment and remind everybody what we heard from all of you as we really built this plan together. So next slide, please. Maybe this brings back a flashback of sitting in the plaza or the Paramount eating some popcorn. So we looked at a lot of stuff like this. Next slide, please. And really, sorry, progress again. We heard a lot of different kind of main topics. Just push the next. I think this is an animated slide. So there we go. These are some very high level things, just a quick summary. So we are hearing from everyone that a lack of an effective strategic plan leads the staff to being pulled in many different directions and potentially not working on the most important things. Enabling our residents to understand what we do and what the regional district does, it was really important. There's a lot of misconceptions as to what powers we have and why. Next slide. And communication and branding was really hugely identified. We'll progress again. We break this down a little further and we looked at our resident expectations. Next progression. Increased communication and transparency. And I mean, that is something we really want to capture with this new plan. And as Scott showed with the old plan, it was really not an easy to read document. And so to have something that we could use to actually regularly communicate would be really important, we realized. And on top of that, it was an opportunity for us to explain to the residents what the TNRD does, because we're hearing from everyone regularly that was a problem. Next progression. And the other thing was that generally there was a comment, most people just don't think about the TNRD unless they need something from us. And so this document can actually sit, because it looks so nice, can actually sit on like a coffee table. It can actually be a reading document. It can remind people about the TNRD before they want something. Yeah, next slide. Around communication, this is one of the big things, and Scott already mentioned this, but we heard this multiple places, that really the whole leadership performance plans and development strategies should outline kind of pulling together the operational objectives and linking it to the strategic plan. It was very hard with that previous plan to make linkages. People are having a hard time operationalizing it. Next progression. And again, that's really ultimately what this line says as well, is connecting those departmental priorities to the overall TNRD strategic plan was really important, so that when we're reporting on one, we're reporting on both of them. Next progression. And then the idea of being able to provide ongoing updates on the strategic plan and how we're accomplishing it. Next progression. And we can do that also by monitoring key performance indicators and reporting more frequently. Next progression. So what we did is we took all this feedback, and that is a very high level reminder. And then we took, you might remember, we had this slide that talked about board governance. It really talked about how we're going to be focusing on, at a board level, we really want to focus on the oversight, the vision, the direction. There's that imaginary line, and then you have really achieving that vision and direction, which is the operational side. Next slide. So what you're going to see is that the structure of this whole report, besides being visually very appealing, it's a nice document to look at, it's impressive. It actually, the overall structure of the report actually lends to this good governance foundation. So you can see up at the top, really, at the top is the oversight, vision, and direction. And then there's that imaginary line again. And then down below, you can see directly below that strategic direction, the actual operational side. So how we're going to achieve this. Next slide. The other thing too is we really want to make a quick comment that we are building off a foundation. We do not want to reinvent the wheel. So this is a very quick slide just to show that I think it was up to 70 different priorities and items from the previous plan were incorporated in this plan as well. And I think with that, I'm going to hand it back to Scott to kind of do a bit more of a rollout of the what the plan looks like.
Great, thank you, Colin. So where are we going? Next slide, please. So as you've all seen, what the draft looks like, I think we put together a strategy template that we can use into the future, and it's adaptable, it's flexible, and we can certainly be creative as we move forward, but gives us a good base. Next slide, please. We laid out our role, we laid out our commitments, things that couldn't be more important right now as you read through those commitments, and of course the purpose of the plan. The one comment we heard was residents are confused about what to expect from the TNRD, so we were able to explain to residents what we do and how we can help. Next page, please. We've defined our key focus areas, what they look like. We are very creative with that, and they're very broad. So encompassing priorities such as strategic relationship and partnerships, dynamic communication and branding, economic sustainability and resiliency, climate action and environmental stewardship, livability, connectivity, and infrastructure, and of course, emergency planning and response. Certainly some great focus areas. The comments or the quote up top, the TNRD should be communicating what we're doing in the region and organizationally that align with the strategic plan. So again, we're listening to the feedback. We created clear goals. So Colin talked a little bit about how this lays out the wishes of the board from a strategy standpoint. We created clear goals, explained why this is important, created action items and timelines that show how and when we're going to accomplish these items. And again, connecting to the quote, we connect departmental priorities to overall TNRD strategic plans. So reporting on one is reporting to both. Measuring success is extremely important. This is critical in any plan or strategy, and something we want to build into our yearly meetings. What came up in that meeting was reviewing this document twice a year or as needed. So monitor key performance indicators and report frequently. So as far as next steps go, if you go to the next one, thank you. So I'm looking for board approval for the plan, of course, after we get some feedback. I know there's feedback from the group that I've talked to a lot of you already, but would like to get some formal feedback so we can make some changes. We'd like to use this until the end of 2022, whereby then we will go and refresh it again using the same format, hopefully. We'd like to bring updates and progress back to the board at least twice a year, or I'm sorry, I missed that.
I fed the dogs this morning.
Oh, Steve, could you put your on mute? I think we got it. Great. The one important thing that I wanted to bring some awareness to is linking our performance management process to our strategic plan. I'm going to show you that on the next page, but really linking it in a meaningful way. And then, of course, currently exploring a scorecard. I think there's a scorecard that we could come up with that I'd like to see on our website for our residents to see how we're progressing in certain areas. So this is just a snapshot of what our leadership performance plans look like for 2021. This happens to be Debbie's, but I wanted to make sure that the board understood that the priorities of us as the management team and the staff and our employees links directly to the strategic plan and does so on a yearly basis to create that win-win, because what we do operationally should always be focused on what the board is looking at from a strategic plan priority standpoint. I talked a bit about scorecard metrics. These are just a few we've come up with, but we are working on something as far as a scorecard goes. We'd like to develop a scorecard that could be updated monthly and live on our website. And there's more to come on that one. So any ideas and thoughts around that would be welcome as well. So there you have it. It's just a quick overview to kind of refresh your memory from what we've done. The document I think everyone had in their hand. So now I'd like to hear from all of you. Certainly share kind of ideas, thoughts, things we may have missed. If there's detailed things, or if Director Roden has more feedback, please put them in an email again. I'd be glad to update the document, but I think we got a good start and would love to hear from you. So thanks everyone. Thanks Colin for that.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Director Laird.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Under elector area strategies, where area M&N is working on the Pioneer Park in Lower Nicola, and we are wondering how how we could get that put into the strategy.
Great, thank you. As we discussed a little bit earlier today, thank you for that question. I think it's important that we, I love the fact that we added the EA section on there, because a lot of our infrastructure projects and a lot of the work we do are in the electoral areas. And I know gas tax projects and initiatives are extremely important as well, but we've got to find a way to maybe create a separate document and create that list of all these priorities and all these gas tax funded priorities, so that we can match resources to those and make sure that we are meeting your expectations and meeting the expectations of staff and our residents as well. So I think that would be a good topic to share some of those things on the EA call that we're going to start in March, and be able to start understanding what those projects are. Most of them are all public already. We've been talking about them, but now just prioritizing them so that we can do a good job at executing against them.
Thank you, Director Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Scott, I think it's a really good document. I went through it piece by piece. But I do have a couple of questions. One of them, and I've been around this regional district a long time, and I can tell you that people still don't know what we do. 20 years later, they still don't know what we do. And I have probably one of the most senior of population within the regional district. Most of them don't even want to deal with computer. They don't know about websites. But if I hold a public meeting, I get a lot of people because they want to know what's happening. But that's generally only because we're dealing with something within their specified area. So what I want to know is, under specific priorities through electoral area strategy, how we're going to accomplish a new consulting process.
Good question. And I think you read my mind. One thing I wanted to talk about, and I'm not sure if everyone remembers, but during that session at the Paramount Theater, somebody brought up the idea of a newsletter. And I know I've met with communications and with Debbie as well. And we would like to initiate our first newsletter this year. And it's not ideal, but we think the first time we want to do a mail out, and we want to hit the entire TNRD and try to get support, get email addresses, get people linked to our website, just to get more people involved so we can communicate in a more efficient way. But to start, I think a newsletter would make sense, and that would reach that demographic and help engage and include them a little bit easier.
And I had another, may I, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, go ahead.
I had another one under economic sustainability. One of the things it says is support community trail initiatives. And I have over the last couple of years been trying to think of a way to connect to Kamloops through the trails along the lake. And I think what I need, and probably someone from Kamloops, preferably one of the politicians at this point, as to how we can accomplish that under the gas tax through yourself and getting that kind of started, because we only have about 18 months and we're back up for elections. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I know I think it was Director O'Reilly that him and I talked about that already a few months back, and that he has that similar idea. So we need to get together and just understand what that might look like and how we can engage the city of Kamloops and make that potentially happen.
Yeah, because it's under the gas tax and we can do it. It's
Yeah,
just,
absolutely.
just how we do that. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Director O'Reilly.
That came up quite quick. Thank you. I think I just want to comment more on the overall strategic plan and where we're at as an organization. As much as strategic plans are always important, I think the TNRD, we are charting a new path forward. We're doing something completely different that we haven't done in well over a decade. And so as much as the details are important, I think the overall vision of where we want to take the regional district as a whole is what was captured in this for me. And that to me is probably the most important part. As was mentioned, I believe it was Director Elliott said, you know, this is essentially, it wasn't a refresh of a strategic plan. It was a brand new strategic plan that is only going to last for 18 months. The details of it, but the overall vision and where we're taking it will hopefully carry on to future boards and where we believe the regional district should go. I think the timing works out extremely well, given everything that's happened in the media right now, especially when we're looking at governance and oversight. That will play very well. And I do think it's a plan that staff can have their goals to work towards, and they can build their work plans towards that. And I look forward to seeing those report cards that come back. But again, this is I can't understate how big of a shift this is for the regional district, and I think it's a shift in the right direction. So yeah, congratulations to the whole board for doing this and getting us here, and for Scott for leading the way and you know, taking his vision to us and getting it on paper and hopefully making us more successful in the future.
Thank you, Director O'Reilly.
Thanks, Director O'Reilly. Director Kershaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I agree with Director O'Reilly. This is fantastic. I think it sets a new direction. I'd just like to make one small note on the back of the page. It says Adams Lake Homestead. That little picture, that's actually a schoolhouse. And so I think on the very back page, it says Adams Lake Homestead Lecture Area O. That's the Adams Lake Schoolhouse.
I was taking my lead from Vicki Weller. I thought she'd be the expert, so I will certainly review that with her.
Yeah, it's just somebody will point it out to you, definitely, somewhere along the way.
You know, Bill, I actually noticed that because I drive by that all the time when I'm in Barrier with my wife. And it's funny you say that because I keep forgetting to make a comment. Thank you.
Some of us spent time in schoolhouses sufficient to make people think we were homesteading. So now, Director Schaefer.
I'd just like to ask Scott concerning the newsletter. the first newsletter, are you going to explain what the TNRD does in the vision, or are we just going to explain what we're doing? Because it would be nice for everybody to know, if you're sending it out to everybody,
That's right.
what the regional district does.
Thank
And
you
what
for
do we
that
do?
question. And we're working on the scope right now, but I think we need to start from the start. We actually have to talk about right from the beginning. I think we got to educate them right from the ground up. And so we even want to potentially get to the point where we're doing interviews with each of the electoral areas in the city of Kamloops and providing information on what's happening in each of those, and being really creative with the document. So absolutely.
Thanks, Director Rain.
Thank you and congratulations, everyone. Just on the last comment, I was thinking about timing. Given all the free publicity we're getting these days, we should be very careful on the timing here so that it doesn't look like we're trying to cover things up and everything. So I just get some advice from a public relations point of view when the first newsletter should come out. The question I have, and I need a reminder on the session we had, is there any meaning to the numbering of the focuses? And I'm sure we all have different opinions, but is focus 1 more important than focus 2?
No.
And if not, should we be thinking about what is the focuses? And I from a personal point of view, and I appreciate others may have a very different opinion. I mean, I would have put it in economic. Sorry, I got to get my glasses here. Since I have my eye operation. The economic sustainability 1, livability 2, the strategic relationships, climate, emergency planning, and then communications last. But I'm sure everybody has different preferences, but I think we should think a little bit about how that presents itself. Generally when you see focus 1, you think, well, that would be the highest priority, but obviously in a strategic plan, that's not necessarily so. But just a thought.
Yeah, no, very good feedback. I made a note of that. As far as your first question, though, on timing, I know that will be important. We were thinking to do a spring and fall, so a couple months from now would probably make sense.
Thank you, Director Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I also appreciate this work. I have a couple of questions around in implementation. So one of the things I found interesting about strategic planning is that plan goes, plan is made, and then we start working the plan, and then, sometimes people raise things kind of in meetings that are new or are different, and, how we handle those things is kind of important, I think, having a process that's kind of defined, and it's not, it has to be nimble, but it also has to be kind of enduring. So that's kind of the challenge there. And then the second thing is that the concept of a scorecard is kind of interesting, but I think a scorecard is only good if you talk about things that you're struggling with, because people don't want it just to be kind of a PR exercise. They want it to be kind of like, where is actually so economic development at the regional level, as far as I've been involved with here, is never been that clear. The Film Commission is very clear, and ECDAV hasn't been very clear. So, what are we doing around those things to kind of try? That's one example of where I think there are some sort of interesting challenges for us as a big region to try and figure out what we're doing, and with 26 of us and everybody having different ideas on things, how you handle those. So there's, I guess, two questions. One is, the nimbleness versus the sort of enduring nature of a thing, how you handle that, and secondly, how we hold when we're struggling, and actually talk about that to our residents and to our people we serve in a way that's actually not just window dressing.
Great advice. I would agree with you. I think the change part, and as things come, things do change, and sometimes our priorities will change. And I think that's why reviewing this document twice a year, I think, provides the opportunity to the board to jump on trends or to potentially delete something or change something. And as far as the scorecard, I couldn't agree more. The last thing you'd want to see on there is 10 kind of scorecard items, and we're 10 of 10 or however we manage it, because I know for a fact after the media recently, we're not 10 of 10, so we got some work to go there. But the example you bring up on economic development, it's something that we're exploring right now. We're going to bring back to that committee in the near future. And we have some ideas with the structure of the organization that might lead to that or lend to that.
Yeah, just something. I mean, I think that the work we've done in strategic planning in the past, in my mind, has been very good. It has been work that I think the consultants we've used in the past have led us to a good place in our last, sort of iterations of boards. I think this is also a different way of doing it, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to really work this out on the ground the best way possible.
Thank you.
Thanks, Director Staber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, thanks very much to staff. I had a couple of things too, if I may. First off, and I didn't want to leave this a bad taste in anybody's mouth because I don't want to be, this wasn't the last thing I wanted to say, but going back to our last strategic meeting, and I brought it up to staff's attention yesterday, and where we had an opportunity to talk about this was that when we had that strategic meeting, we had a member of the public give a blessing and then remained at the meeting. And I think I don't think I'm the only one that was uncomfortable with having that person there. Not that we have anything to hide, but if we're going to continue to do that and no slight on the person that was there, then I'm going to invite Uncle Bob, because quite frankly, we had a discussion before that about inclusion of other governments in the strategic type planning, and that's fine. But my point was at that time is that unless we have the same type of transparency with those organizations that we have here, I'm not interested in that. So that's the one point I wanted to make. But what I wanted to talk about a little bit on this document is that as we go forward, and as Director Singh was kind of bringing it up with getting out to the public, is there any way that when somebody from the public is looking at, say, something like this, that we have links to this so that, for an example, on the livability, connectivity, and infrastructure, when we're talking about infrastructure projects, and one of the line items says begin progress of Royal Inland Hospital Phase 3 and parking project planning. If somebody was, and I'm not asking staff to do a whole bunch of stuff, but going forward, is there a way that somebody can actually click on that and see what's actually going on? Is there a way that we can explain what we're doing other than the condensed form that we have? Because I think not only would that be beneficial to the public, but it also would be beneficial to the board. And it's just a suggestion on how we can try to develop it. I'm not suggesting we have 55 pages, but I'm just saying, is there a way that we can do these links? No different than the way we've done it now where, with new websites like the District of Barrier, we just put a brand new website together, more interactive, easier for people to get information, to be able to tag things. Is there a way that the TNRD can do that on the information side of things so that they can at least have a way to get to that additional information, so that if they want to know about Phase 3 in Royal Inland, that will either show them how to get there or a way that we can log to that. I'm not sure if the rest of the directors think that's important, but I just think it would explain more than what we're doing. And then as we track it, as Director O'Reilly said, we'll have a better idea of how the progression is going. So we'll be able to see, instead of just saying Q1, Q2, Q3, we'll actually see for ourselves how things are progressing. And then all of a sudden, if something else comes up, or there's an improvement, or there's something else that's now a benefit to the region, we're able to respond quicker than just waiting 6 months to our next strategic plan. Thank you.
Mr. Hildebrand, I'm hoping you'll respond to that because I
got it. Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Chair Gillis. Your first point, I think it was a fair comment, and that was just an oversight. And I think that's something we need to be more aware of. And then the second comment, I absolutely think we can create links in the website version of this document. So when it's on there, I will work with our IT team and our communications team to link back to the hospital district, or link back to other pieces of information that will help people understand a bit more about them. So we'll look into that. I've taken a note of that.
Thank you. If I may add, Mr. Chair, a lot of this stuff now, it's all in speed. And so if you go to some of these websites now, if they don't respond quick enough, most of the time people aren't interested and they'll just go somewhere else. But if we have a way where that person, touches on the TNRD icon or however that is, boom, you're inside, and then you're in there and you're doing your thing. Mayor Blackwell probably knows better than I do about how these websites work, and that, if you get to a website and you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting, most people will just turn around and go do something else. So, kudos to our IT staff, because they've got a pretty good website now. It's way better than what we've had in the past, and I look forward to the improvements that they're planning on making, because it makes it so much easier for us to get our message out to the public. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Stamer. Are there any further questions with respect to
Director
the?
Swan was,
Oh, Director Swan, sorry.
Thank you. Just a comment on the strategic plan itself. It's a beautiful document, but we need to get it in the hands of the public. Has there been any thought to putting them in our local libraries?
It's on my list. Thank you for that. I think that's a great idea, and we need to make sure we engage with those folks as well. So
Yeah, it's great to have the document, but if people don't see it, it doesn't do any good.
Exactly.
great idea.
Thank you.
Any further questions with respect to the strategic plan? I'm not seeing any. Okay, I guess that will take us to the.
Chair Gillis, I just
Sorry.
had one last comment because I thought for sure I would get feedback on this one about the actual picture of the board. We thought that was creative. Everyone talks about that. I think it fits well in here, but didn't hear any criticism, so I'm assuming it stays. So. Yes,
Is that the
COVID
last
version.
photograph? That's awesome.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for your feedback. I appreciate it. If you have more, simply send me an email and we'll work on this and hopefully we can get your blessing going forward.
Well, I've got some feedback for you on that photograph, Mr. Hildebrand. I'm a little bit concerned that even after the pandemic that the public might demand that we have similar photographs in the future. So. Public engagement report. There's a report from our Director of Development Services. And I understand that she's going to elaborate on that.
Good morning, everybody. It's warm in here. I've just begun. I will not thank you to the members of council. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm sorry. But I did want, my purpose here today is, and it's actually the timing. I don't know who planned this agenda in this order, but it works because I'll pick up on some of the issues that were raised in your strategic plan just now. So my purpose is to secure from you any concerns that you have with what we do in the realm of public consultation. So what are your expectations, what we can do going forward, but in the realm of development services, specifically planning. Now, please recall, and in this room, we had a zoning bylaw amendment public hearing in November, and it didn't go as well as it could have. And that project, I worked on that, and I have nobody else to blame but me. We started that project. It took most of last year because we worked on it in the spring, then we brought it before the committee, the whole in June, in the Delta Hotel there with 940. And then I worked on that through the balance of the year and brought it to public hearing in November. So that's the kind of, think of that. I'm not going to go over all the details that are attached in the report. I'll spare you that. What it is a highlighted and annotated version of the Local Government Act that applies to all local government BC, and in our TNRD Development Procedures bylaw, which we must have, that spells out the specifics from the legislation. So let's talk briefly about the kinds of notice we give when we have applications to do with land. The Local Government Act basically substantially has not changed since before they invented the internet. So even the Municipal Act of 1999 had the same provisions for public hearings before it became the Local Government Act and the Community Charter. And there's really two kinds of notice when somebody's doing something and they have to go through notice. And this applies also in all your municipalities and in the city of Kamloops. If there is a minor change that doesn't trigger a public hearing, so a border variance, a development variance, a TUP in an OCP area, it's typically just a mail out. Whatever the mail out is specified in your bylaw, but it must exceed what's in the act. Then if you have a greater land use change, and that can be a rezoning, an OCP, when we repealed the land use contracts, it can be, say you have a covenant that a property is in a zone, then it's subject to a covenant that further refines what that land use is. Even if you don't change the zone, if you change that covenant, you need to go through a public notice process, ads in the paper, and a public hearing. So, and there's a few interesting things in the legislation, and I put one, I will read one thing from there, and I put it in bright red. And again, this has been in there since even when I was in consulting. If, where is it? It is on page 2 of the report. The whole process whereby sending letters to all the adjacent property owners does not apply if 10 or more parcels owned by 10 or more different people are the subject of the bylaw alteration. So when we have a rezoning application like the public hearings you had yesterday in Cherry Creek and up in Jesmond, I think each of the, well, the Jesmond one didn't trigger a whole lot of mail out because it was in the back of Beyond. But there was about 39 or so properties mailed out. There was a sign on the land. There was adverts in the paper. There was, nobody showed up other than the applicant spoke. But we can say that that went through a fairly robust process. Nobody should be surprised. However, when we do a change like what we did last year, there was every property in the TNRD was impacted, not just River Shore. So on that one, that's often, and we only do those kinds of changes once every 3 years or so. Or when we have a whole new zoning bylaw, or say one of your municipalities changes, if you change the definition of accessory building, that affects every property in your municipality. So in cases like that, that's more than 10 properties by more than 10 owners. So with our changes last year, if you recall, things like backyard chickens, there was, way back, I took a report about zoning anomalies that have been with us since the TNRD was invented. There was hundreds of properties affected, but even so, through that year, last year, what we did is, after we got the go-ahead from you at Committee of the Whole, I went to the APC, all our APCs, our AAC, I went to the improvement districts, either in person or mailed them the full report with a sort of a discussion document, asked for their input. I went to the 4-H clubs. I went to the folks who had something to say when we brought in the livestock limits like 6 years ago. What else did I do? I went to, we had, of course, the ads in the paper. I sent a 6-page detailed letter in summer to the strata of River Shore. I answered their questions by phone. I don't know what else, and in there was more detail than they'd ever find in the paper or any kind of a notice. So really, every 3 years or so when we do such a bylaw change, in my time here, so we've done at least 3 or 4 of those, every time we do one, we have escalated the scale of consultation and notification, but I kind of feel like we're not doing enough. So the kinds of things we heard at the public hearing, well, yeah, there was an ad in the paper, but nobody reads the paper except for this week. Landowners, sometimes landowners don't read the paper because frankly, they own property in the TNRD, but they live in the Lower Mainland or Alberta or who knows where. I know when we do the mail outs for Sun Peaks, lots of people are in Australia. They might not get the mail in time. But in other cases where what I've heard sometimes, we'll send people the mail and they think it's a flyer or something and they just toss it in the bin or the recycling bin. So what I'm here is to maybe suggest some ideas for what we can do going forward, even for those ones with the mail outs where it isn't a wholesale zoning change. So what we have done in the last little bit, we have significantly broadened the mail out. So in a place like Whitecroft or Pritchard, even if there's a variance, we're sending out 100 letters with all the details enclosed. The example of the variance on Loon Lake yesterday, because we have heard some complaints after some of these buildings go up, after they're approved, because the neighbors really didn't know from our notice. Like, they didn't complain, they didn't submit opposition, then the building went up, and then they went off the deep end. So I've looked at what other folks do. So here's some ideas. We can yet again, mail is cheap and it's just paper. We can broaden the mail out further, even further. It's more staff stuffing on anything we do at this point. We'll have we're already exceeding the legislation. So anything we do, I need you to know it will have staffing implications. We can stuff more envelopes. We have revised our public hearing ads to be more friendly, more plain speak, more visual, and we spend good money on those, each of those ads. So say we get $1,500, which is our fee for rezoning, each of those ads are $1,000. Just putting that out there. But then and we have to do those ads, so we should do them well. We can increase the size of the sign that's on the land that's set out in our bylaw, and it's the last page of your report. We can go to groups like, well, this is going to be a minefield, but if we select Facebook groups, there's, I don't know how many communications isn't here, but there's dozens of Facebook groups in the TNRD. When we looked at the Loon Lake one, there's 3 Facebook groups just for Loon Lake. Do we go to all 3? Some of them would be offended perhaps if we put something out there. What are you doing? This is our Facebook group. Don't put a notice of a variance in it. I know when I worked in a smaller municipality where we send out the taxes every year, which is not the same in a regional district, but when we were allowed one side of one sheet in with the taxes, which people do open those envelopes, they don't recycle those, I hope, if they want to keep their house. I took that one sheet and I put in as much as I could, because I also looked after bylaw enforcement. So I reminded them about sprinkling regulations. I let them know about major projects or zoning, new zoning bylaws or new OCP. So at that point, and I tried to make it interesting. I used pictures, color. We've never done that in the TNRD. So it's not easy, it's not cheap, but if we could get some purchase with that, and that's the newsletter that Scott had spoken about, that might be one idea. And then I guess really anything, I'm here to listen to you, to hear what your expectations are, and if you have any ideas, and it might not even all come today. This might require a bylaw change or at least a practice change in how we do things in development services.
Thanks ever so much, Ms. Sadilkova. And I fear that no matter what you do, it'll never be enough, but.
I accept that.
In any case, Director Stamer, you had a question.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks very much, Regina. A couple of things. It's funny you mentioned about putting it in the bills. We've done that in Barrier forever, because that's the one bill that they have to open. So I had a couple of questions on that. Number one, I agree with you on everything that you've said on trying to get more information out there. One, on the costing of the mailing, how much more does it cost to have the registered portion of that where they have to sign for that?
So even Canada Post has told us not to bother.
Why is that?
Because certainly with the COVID rules, yes, there's a lot we have to do, like the Section 57s must go registered, but if we have their email, we also send it by snail mail and email.
Yes.
So we cover it so they could really.
Okay, so I'm just thinking, like, when you mentioned also about the Facebook pages and things like that, I think as long as you're doing everything that you've mentioned, including the larger signs and everything else, but making sure that on our TNRD website that we have those updates so that
we do.
Yeah, I know you do, but I'm just saying making sure that they're flagged so that again, all of the bases are covered. I think is great. I think everything that you're doing right now is probably more than a lot of other regional districts are doing.
It's a perennial complaint, but like last year, really, I was very concerned because the amount of work we did was exponentially more than ever before, and that bylaw was on the verge of defeat. Nobody came to the public hearing to say, I'm waiting for backyard hens. I'm waiting for this, that, and the other thing. And I think if it wasn't for Director Singh and Mayor Christian saying something, that whole process in 3/4 of a year, that work would have been lost. And what you ended up doing, if you recall, you just took the river shore out. But there's people in River Shore who wanted that change and were waiting for it, but they weren't at the public hearing and they were aware of it. Sorry, that was probably a strong response.
Thanks.
Thank you for passing the rest of the bylaw.
Director Elliott?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Regina, one of the things that you did, I'm not sure how long ago, but when we changed what went into the paper to make it so that people understood where it was instead of a land title.
Yeah, we use we use a diagram.
Yes, it makes so
And
much
address.
difference
Yeah.
to the people that are around the area.
Yeah.
Because they understand Abbey Road or they understand the highway or whatever. So that was a good thing. And I don't know that you're gonna.
Well,
Personally,
Facebook
from my
is, social
point of-
media is the big question, whether we go down that path with land use applications. We have not gone down that, we go that way with, say, the rates change for garbage or something. I know
Why
our
can't we do a
communication-
pilot project? Find out.
Yeah, it's not expensive. That's not expensive compared to other things.
Well, if you put it on Facebook in one or two of the little municipalities or one of the regional, one of the electoral areas and see what happens. You might, I mean, you might get told to leave. They don't want to talk about planning.
Thank you, Director Rice.
Can you guys hear me? Because Mike's stable. I'm unstable right now, really unstable.
We know that.
You can hear you.
Okay. Well, I agree with Director Stamer and everything that's been said. And Regina, the job you've been doing is incredible. That said, I really caution against the Facebook thing. And I only say that because the same people that sort of scream and yell are fairly lazy. And they scream and yell, but they got to do a little bit of rolling up their sleeves and do a little bit of homework and find stuff. And we already got it out there. And if you put stuff like on the Spencer's Bridge Community's Facebook page, I'm telling you, these lazy people will be screaming and yelling about everything you post on there. So sort of careful what you wish for with Facebook, in my opinion. And that's all I had to say.
Thanks, Director Rice. Director Christian.
Yeah, thank you. And let the record indicate I agree with Director Rice. You know, I think, you know, no matter how much you're going to try to engage everybody, if it's a controversial issue, people are going to say that we weren't told, we just found out about this, no matter what you do. And I think you take some risks when you start to stray away from what the legislation requires of us. And I think that we do what's required in the legislation and do it well. And then people will find us when they want to, when there's a controversial thing. In the city of Kamloops, we have extended the mail out reach for some of our public hearing applications. And that was as a result of one that was contentious, but 99% of the time, it just adds cost to the developer. It doesn't serve to get greater engagement with the community. And I really am opposed to using social media platforms.
Good. Okay.
They're not secure. They are controlled outside of the country for the most part, and they really do not do a good service to government.
Thanks, Director Christian. And I probably won't have anything to say on this matter beyond this, but I certainly agree with Director Christian's comments and Director Rice. Correct. Director O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a few comments. I mean, it's a difficult thing when we're meeting the legislation, as you've said.
We're exceeding it.
Exceeding, right? But we're meeting the minimum requirements. That's great. I think what makes it difficult and why things are voted against amongst the board is if we know that other things are being done, so as an example, Mayor Christian said we expand the mail out areas on certain ones that could be controversial. If that's, and I'd like to hear your feedback on that, because your facial reaction says I don't want to go down, but
I'd have to, somebody would have to decide which ones.
well, and that's why I'm saying it becomes very subjective. But if that's brought up to the board when we approve the public hearing to increase the mail out areas, for me, as Mayor Christian said, we aren't going to get to everybody. They're going to complain about what they want to complain about. But I feel like maybe some people on the board like to have that fallback. That, you know what, we did this, regardless of what you're saying, you didn't get it or not. It gives me an avenue to fall back on and say, you know what, we went way above and beyond. And it does happen in the city of Kamloops. And sometimes a councillor will make a motion to increase the size of the mail out area or not. And again, it adds complexities, but again, it just gives us that fallback to pass these items that you've been working on for the better part of a year.
So on the mail out, we follow the very typical process. Is a letter with the owner's name. So it's in a proper envelope. It's, you know, with their name on the cover, not to for an occupant, but for a landowner. Occupant, we wouldn't know their name, but for the landowner, we do. Then we insert a notice. That notice is a standard kind of notice, and it looks like what you think it's going to look like. It's a legal document. That's why with the metric comes in, we cite the bylaw. Here's what's proposed. Here's something I suggest we can do. We can't put in the whole staff report because that would be biased. So I don't want to send to the neighborhood what staff is recommending, because it really, to the neighbors, they can make up their own mind. But what I think we can do, like, we put a lot of effort, we put maps, we put images in, it helps communicate, and it's faster and easier to read rather than a whole bunch of text, government text. So I think we can put in a summary sheet with photos and images for each application every time we do a mail out. 1 or 2 pages, only one double-sided page, not a 10-page report. We already do reports for our AAC and APCs without recommendations or BOV. We already do that. So we call them fact sheets, like just the facts, ma'am. They also have pictures and images and application information, not applicant names, typically. We can insert that in the envelope. It might increase readership and lessen the amount that goes into the recycle bin, if it's professional done.
Yeah, and I definitely appreciate that. And in the same breath, I think the only time that this really becomes a big topic around this table is when things don't go really the way we want them to go, right? And so if we know, again, it's subjective, but if we, our development services staff know that this one could be potentially controversial, it could be flagged to the board and say, you may want to extend the notification area on X.
Okay.
Yeah, again, using
that would require a bylaw amendment, but it's a straightforward bylaw. It's a development procedures bylaw, and it's readily amendable.
Right. Sounds good. Thank you.
Sounds good. I have Director Swan, Blackwell, and Singh. Director Swan. Oh, and Director Quinn and Director Duty.
We're lining up. I would like to go on record as saying I agree with Directors Rice and Christian that we stay away from social media. We have an ongoing issue here with our proposed public works building. And the majority of comments that are coming on Facebook, there's so much misinformation. And a lot of the comments are from people that don't even live in the community. So what is the point? You put it out there and you get all these negative comments, misinformation. And when people read what other people have commented, they don't realize it's misinformation. So I think it does more harm than good.
Thanks, Director Swan. Director Singh.
So quickly, what I wanted to say was I really, I think staff do a very good job. And I think part of it is around when, you know, trying to do this on the fly kind of thing, you know, in a meeting, or, you know, if we have a structured process to look at our public consultation around development, and we have some staff recommendations and to work on, I think that would be the right way to, well, I think it's gonna come down. to do it. But I we had that one thing in November. I know Ms. Nicola was quite concerned that it would go kind of sideways, and but I think that ultimately, we also as directors have to kind of respect the fact that we have processes that have been put in place, and I think when things are controversial, not start to kind of we have to make decisions around things in the moment sometimes, and sometimes we can make motions, they pass or fail, and we go from there. But I think that's if we do it all the time, that's a real problem, right? Secondly, I think that there is this notion of people. I really value the public engagement process that we have, especially in a big region like the TNRD. And I know that there's forces out there in the province that say we should have less consultation. You can actually, if someone's in your OCP as the local government, anyways, you can actually just put it through. You don't have to have a public hearing half the time. That's actually the law. No one follows that
They'd
part.
be beaten up.
It can be done, right? So I'm happy with how it's going. I don't think that we should be, just throwing out there things. We should do this in quite a thoughtful way, right? That's number one. Number two, and I can talk about social media all day, but I think it's important for us also when there are misinformation and things, how do we counteract that in the best way, right? And sometimes actually getting on social media and posting, not all the time, but just a sort of a statement actually helps calm people down. So that's a part. I wouldn't say we do it proactively. I say we do it in more kind of a reactive kind of a mode in that sense. So those are my comments.
Okay.
Thank you, Director Quinn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to reiterate, stay off social media. We've got so many of them out there. We have no control over it. And as Director Swan said, there's all sorts of stuff gets out there. It has a place in society. It's useful. But I would rather that we kept up putting good information on our website and making sure that it's proper. Social media can become very toxic very quickly, and it's almost like a fire you can't put out. And we need to be really clear on how we do this. And I hear us saying that we're going to go through the website. I know Arjun is a great social media person, but he knows if you start down that avenue or put any kind of disclaimer out of it, you've lost the battle right there. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Quinn. Director Duty.
Thank you, Chair. When it comes to public engagement, I think it comes down to accountability, and that accountability is not just for the region, it's also for the public. So it means that they have to exercise some due diligence on their part as much as we need to make certain that whatever required information is out there. I don't think there's any definitive way of us satisfying everyone, regardless of what we do to try to get that information out to them. So if we currently exceed the requirements, then I feel we should just leave it at that. And that we should make certain that we're doing our job, which we have been doing, and the public needs to make sure that they do their job and seek for that information themselves.
Okay. I hear we are not going to Facebook. Thank you.
Director Rain.
Yeah, just a slight reaction to the comment. We don't put staff's recommendation in the information. That's a two-edged sword. Certainly, I personally would prefer to see the staff's recommendation, because if I'm going to react to something, it may be that, in fact, this looks like it's moving forward based on this staff recommendation. So if I'm opposed, then they're going to react stronger. If I'm not told, then I say, well, they deceived me. They didn't tell me that staff were actually going to, so it's a little bit.
It is a very double-edged sword. So a notice, like think yesterday with the variance, the board has the same with zoning, by the way. You can deny an application at first reading before an advert is even in the paper or any letters go out, or a variance or a TUP. Most local governments feel like, well, the applicant paid, they should get the mail out. But really, legally, you have that right to deny it. If you give it first reading, you are letting the public know that we're entertaining approving this, whatever it is.
Thank you, Director Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Where does the applicant come in this? my thought is that if I was doing something that was going to go to public hearing, I would make sure all the people that could come and support me would know about it.
Yeah.
Do we have any idea what transpires with that?
So there are some local governments that in their procedures bylaws, development procedures bylaws, ask the applicant to hold a public meeting. In my experience, and I've worked where they do, sometimes those public meetings can result in more misinformation. And I've seen that can go either way. I've always, if an applicant or developer has a public meeting of their own, I always attend, just because I want to be there to hear what is said and what the response is, or one of the staff will attend. I am not a proponent of requiring those meetings for all applications, but we have, if it's a Board of Variance, for example, we tell folks, if you know your neighbors, it doesn't hurt to let them know that this is coming through, because they're going to get a letter anyway. That's not a public meeting. But again, in my experience, what people do, and maybe because they're Canadian, if somebody's doing a variance because they're doing an overheight building or something, the applicant will knock on their door, they'll listen politely, they'll go, thank you very much. And as soon as that door is closed, they're on the phone to City Hall to say, look, how can I stop this? But they're not going to tell their neighbor who they like, I don't want that big garage blocking my view.
Chair Gillis, sorry, there's a couple of directors on Zoom. Director Smith has been waiting and Director Rothenberger as well.
Okay. Director Singh?
Just a quick, public meetings before, one of the things that's always a reflection around controversial public hearings is people feel like at the end of the process, they're kind of fighting for their lives, right? And I do think, I'm a proponent of having early meetings, because I think if a developer has misinformation, that's on the developer, it's not on the regional district, right? I mean, there is sometimes a move afoot, again, by some provincial associations, that kind of thing, to try and reduce the amount of public input that happens. And the reason why is because public hearings, when they're controversial, are just really ugly processes, and they're really oppositional. It's like you win or you lose that night, usually.
Yeah.
And so, is there a way almost to do earlier on an engagement with some of these more controversial ones? That's only. I mean, I don't know the solution list really, but it's tough when, and we feel as people who are making the final decisions, like kind of back against the wall. Whichever way you vote, you feel horrible by the end of it. So and is there a way for us to do better around early and often engagement, or get developers, or if the real district is bringing forward stuff, is it possible for us to do almost a committee of the whole kind of style, discussion with the public beforehand? Because I think once people get a chance to touch it and feel it and think about it and understand the implications, it's not often as bad as they fear. But at that last minute in the nighttime, usually, well, for the city here, it's not the nighttime, which is good. It's very challenging.
Okay, I hear you, and certainly for us, we don't have as many really as the city does. We don't have as many. Look, you have to have them on a different night or something, or separate from a council meeting often, because so many people attend.
We always have them on the same night almost every time.
Oh, do you? Okay, sorry. I've only been to one. You know what? We will look at that, and in future reports, especially controversial ones, we will make, and we do usually put a note that we expect there to be opposition to an application, because if you recall, the last sort of barn burner one we had was the short-term rental at East Bear Lake, which was denied but recommended by staff. And in that, in the report, we did say that we expect there will be opposition to this.
Thank you. Director Roden, I have Director Roden, Director Smith, and Director Rothenberger on my speaker list. And Director Steen. Pardon? And Director Stamer. So Director Roden.
Thank you, Chair Gillis. Yes, avoid social media. It's a cesspit. Don't stray too far from the legislation, as Director Christian said. I like the fact that we are already going above and beyond. As Director Judy said, We're already going above and beyond. And at the end of the day, people have to take personal responsibility. We heard yesterday about someone who didn't receive a letter that was mailed a week earlier until the Thursday. That is completely out of our control. We mailed them in plenty of time. If that did not get to them until the Thursday before whatever, that is due to the vagaries of Canada Post. We cannot control that. We took all good steps.
Yep.
So there are things that we can't control. People have to understand that. They might not like it. But as I said, people have to take personal responsibility. You know, I don't want to read that notice. Oh, I ignored the sign that I drove past every day. Well, that's on you.
Thanks, Director Roden. Director Smith?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think a lot of the sentiments have already been mentioned by other members of the board, but I do applaud Ms. Sadilkova's efforts already. I know that communication is always challenging and very, very costly as well when you're getting into advertising and all of those sorts of things. And as some of the others have already said, if we're already exceeding you know, the expectations of what we're supposed to be performing at, then I think that that's good. And I agree that others do need to take personal responsibility as well. And I've found that Facebook is can be a useful tool, but I use it very, very sparingly myself. Because I think that sometimes if you use things less often, people tend to pay attention when you do. So sometimes you can over advertise and overshare, and that makes it harder to communicate when you really need to as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Director Smith. Director Rothenberger?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to offer just a different point of view from what's generally being expressed here. I think we're too prone to blaming the people we serve for not knowing things. I don't think it's good enough really that we say simply, well, this is our minimum standard and we'll exceed that a little bit and we've done our job and that's it, and that's their fault if they don't get it. I think we have to constantly be flexible and adaptable and looking for new ways to communicate with people. I mean, yes, they get something in the mail and it looks like a flyer or something and they toss it. Well, I mean, it's not their fault that they haven't found out the information that we're trying to get to them. Maybe it's not our fault that we haven't tried hard enough, but we always need to try harder. With respect to social media, I don't do a lot of social media, but I do find the community Facebook pages can actually be very valuable in notifying people of, say, a public meeting or something of that nature, or of a project that very specifically impacts that particular community. And they very often, people will see it on Facebook where they wouldn't have seen it in the more traditional ways. So I don't think we should just write it off. I don't see why we are so afraid of Facebook if we're careful about the way we use it, and provide some of that information that people need. And if there is misinformation out there, well, Facebook is a darn good way to provide the real facts of what's going on and try to correct some of that misinformation. So I just think we should not just, you know, do just enough and that's it. We should always try to do more. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Rothenberger. Director Stamer, did you have a last comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm wondering with what we're just talking about here with some of the reactions that we're having is that, Regina, is there a way to go through all our, let's say our land use rezoning bylaws and things like that and categorize and identify what is the most, maybe not necessarily controversial, but with your experience being able to flag it so that, because I mean, I know with your experience, you know that when all of a sudden something comes along and all of a sudden it's going to have a significant impact, possibly negative impact on the surrounding area or landowners. Is there a way that we can identify that so that all of a sudden the flag goes up and we know, as Director Singh mentioned, you know, maybe we should be getting at the front of this thing instead of the back of this thing, because as you mentioned, as soon as we get to the first reading, now it looks like we're going to be putting a whole bunch of resources into something that probably isn't a very good idea in the first place. So is there a way, particularly for some of the members that maybe haven't been on the board that long, and as with the evolving bylaws and things like that, is there a way that we can have a meeting or something where we can actually go through those and say, holy cow, that's really going to affect us. City Council has the same issues. You know, developers are always trying to sneak in the back door. We're all familiar with our residents trying to circumvent bylaws just for the sake of circumventing them. Is there a way that we can flag some of those big ticket items so that when something like that comes, similar to what happened yesterday with Loon Lake, and it wasn't just a little bit of an extension. I mean, it was huge, and the flags went up, and it was like, no, the board doesn't even want to entertain it at all, and we defeated that. Is there a way that we can pre-qualify that?
So we can see under our board template, the public consultation and communication is at the very end, right before the attachments. Right under the purpose statement, which is in your agenda, we can put a line in there, or under the summary, so it's very close to the front, and all the detail, like short and brief. Otherwise, like, you know, of course, everything like tries to get loaded to the front of something. We can put a note there.
Well,
sometimes we don't know.
Yeah, my point is here's a perfect example. We're looking over the river right now, and I'm on a 3-story building, right? And I didn't realize that actually the variant allows a six-story building in front of me, or maybe over to the side of me, and I didn't realize that, right? And so not to say that can be changed, but just, you know, there can be things that it was originally set for this. A developer comes along and goes, well, you know what, we can give you this piece of property if you allow us to do this, or if you allow us to do that. I mean, the city council sees it all the time.
Yeah. So one thing I would recommend is that in our development procedures bylaw, that we do an amendment that gives the board power to broaden the mail out. Like, some things you want to do by policy, some things you want to do by bylaw. I do not want it delegated to staff to decide whether to go on social media or to decide whether a mail out is much broader. We already built in 2 different radiuses, depending on if it's rural or not. We are doubling our mail out. We change what's in the envelope, give people more good information, and I think point to it in the board report and hope you look at that, really.
Okay, thanks. Because I'm thinking more along the lines of the board at the beginning, so that
at the very beginning,
so we're aware. So we're aware of this, and then go from there. Okay.
Thanks, and thank you, Ms. Sadilkova, for your.
You're welcome.
I'm sorry, Director Duty apparently.
Well, sorry, and I'll keep this really brief, but I'm a little concerned about us receiving information like that at the outset, because I think we would be skirting the law with respect to an open mind.
Sorry, I'm just suggesting that, not skirting anything, and just that if there's something coming down the pipe and we've categorized it, that's going to be a hot ticket item, similar to what just happened at Loon Lake, that we're at the front of the bus, not the back of the bus.
But because we're categorizing it, we're already saying that we don't have an open mind to the issue. And that's a concern to me, because we have to walk into that public hearing knowing full well that we need to listen to both sides of the story.
I totally agree. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that, like, for example, what happened at Loon Lake is, I mean, it was so much further than what is usually allowed. The flag went up like, oh my goodness, this isn't something that is normally done. And I think I was just saying with Regina and her staff is that if we knew that there's a pretty good chance that there's going to be a controversy about that particular, using East Lake as an example. There's nothing wrong with us to be able to be given information to say, this is very similar to what happened up in East Lake last year. And even though staff may recommend it, this is what happened. I don't know.
We also, on our to-do list, is to bring a board policy on public meetings. If you recall from the North Thompson OCP, that was one of our action list items for where there isn't a public hearing. So, I think we're at committee, so this is a good time to discuss it, but we will bring a proper fulsome report back to the board.
Thanks again, Ms. Sadilkova, and I gather from what you have told us, and you're always very your presentations are always elucidating, and I really welcome them. But I gather from what you have told us that our exceeding of the statutory requirements is not a marginal exceeding. We're going quite a long way beyond the statutory requirements. Am I correct in that?
that's subjective. I'm sorry, that's
Okay.
subjective. You know, there's no statutory requirement for an APC, or, you know, the basic are that you set a distance in a mail out. It's up to you in your bylaw where your mail out can be. We have a broader mail out, and when we have a major project like the zoning or the OCP, we put in extra ads in the newspapers. So we don't just do Kamloops, we
Right.
might do Clearwater, and we might do a few different papers depending on where the project is focused.
Okay. I agree with Director Duty's earlier comments to the effect that if we're already exceeding, and I think it's more than just a marginal exceeding that we are doing, that we pretty well essentially stay with what we're doing. I am a great believer in signs, and we live in a high-speed society. And I noticed a suggestion in your report that we might increase the size of the lettering on the signs, and which I would consider to be a tweak. And I would certainly endorse that idea. But I think Director Duty is correct. We're going to stumble over our own feet if we try to accommodate everybody in every conceivable manner. So that's my 2 cents worth. We do have a recommendation. Moved and seconded. And we've just certainly discussed it to death. So all in favor? That's carried. That, pardon? Yeah. That brings us to COVID-19 funding. And we have there a report from the Director of Finance. Mr. Ray, please.
Thank you, Chair and board members. This is basically, in short, as people will recall, we received a grant, the COVID-19 Safe Restart Grant. All the local governments in BC received a piece that was meant to help the local governments address issues that they were struggling with, operational issues that arose because of COVID. We've been looking at that. We did a little bit of a internal application process with the different departments of the TNRD to find out, or at least ask the question, you know, how have you been impacted? How might we best make use of these funds? And ultimately, the idea was to bring it to yourselves, because the decision really lies with yourselves. But we wanted to bring forward a bit of a recommendation of what staff have proposed, and then also listen to your own ideas and generate some discussion. As part of that, one of the other pieces of information that's been asked for that's sort of contextual with the whole thing is, what have the financial impacts been to the TNRD in the last year because of the pandemic? So summarizing that quickly, early on in the pandemic, we started making sure that expenses that we were incurring that were specifically tied to COVID-19, that we were identifying those and coding them correctly in the accounts to make it easier to go back and review them, so they wouldn't get lost in the lots of other detail of other expenses. And so what you see on the screen here and what's in the report is a summary of those main areas. So again, as you know, with the TNRD and regional districts, we don't have one holistic budget. We have a whole bunch of different services with budgets of their own. So we have to track those costs in those cost centers. So in the cost center of administration, that account showed a balance at the end of 2020 of about $47,883. The library, we set up a separate account there. Was a similar amount, $49,724 coded to that account. And the fire departments also had created their own COVID expense account. The majority of these expenses have to do with the extra PPE, sanitization, and hand wipes and hand sanitizer, physical barriers that we erected, plexiglass around reception in the libraries and in the civic building, and other physical barriers to better separate the workspaces of staff. We were originally sent home to work from home, but as we were phasing back in, the work that was being done was to make sure people could come back and work in the office space and still have a safe physical space to work in that was physically distanced. So there are more walls and barriers and plexiglass screens and things of that nature erected. In the civic building, in our offices in Mission Flats, and the dozen or so libraries that we operate. So the majority of the money that I'm showing up there has to do with that, with the fire departments. Again, there was things like respirator masks that they would share as needed, but couldn't do that anymore. So they had to acquire, individual pieces of equipment and PPE. There was also software licensing to allow, people to zoom into these meetings, staff to meet virtually rather than in a small room, and so forth. So in total, it added up to about $108,000. There's probably other expenses as well. And, the things that come to mind that aren't necessarily counted in there, we swapped out some of the older desktop computers and replaced them with laptops, because if people are going to be attending meetings virtually, they need a camera, they need a microphone that weren't necessarily in existence with the old setup. But those pieces of equipment were due to be swapped out anyway, but it might have been sped up a little bit, swap out more of them, and specifically with the laptops, so there may be some incremental cost there. I haven't necessarily gotten that far into the weeds to include any of those costs in the $108,000. And there's likely some lost revenues as well that would be considered a cost. I don't know if you call it fortunate, but when I compare us to other local governments, other regional districts, I think that's been fairly minimal for us. If you think about the services that were shut during the lockdown, public libraries are supported primarily through the property tax we raise. It's not a revenue center where we're having a lot of drop-in fees or it's not a revenue generator in that sense. The same could be said for the community halls that we own and operate. And we don't have any real recreational facilities like a swimming pool, gymnastics center, things like that. A lot of the other local governments, and including other regional districts, do. And they've seen significant impact, as I'm sure City Kamloops has, and Merritt and other places, with just a lack of those drop-in fees that go towards funding the cost of those facilities. We don't really own or operate any of those. We have some cost-sharing agreements with some of our member municipalities for some of those facilities being used, that we raise property taxes and provide a grant and aid every year, but we haven't really been affected by a significant revenue shortfall. The flip side to that, there's certain costs that we avoided. So primarily, if you think about it, there were a lot of conferences and staff development type training that simply didn't happen this year. FCM is a good example. So I know some of the board members attended the LGLA conference in February, about a year ago. That happened before COVID really hit. FCM was canceled outright. There's some, considerable costs that go into sending directors to FCM. There's airfare, hotels, meals, other incidentals. That was, canceled outright. Things like UBCM, SILGA turned into virtual conferences. So there might have been some registration costs incurred, but quite a bit less in terms of hotel and travel. And the same is true of staff. There's a lot of professional training that, finance department, planning department, GIS, libraries take advantage of every year, and we've supported that with our budget. where either the training was just put off and skipped for the year, or it turned into a virtual conference and again avoided travel and associated costs. Looking at the fire departments, the training costs indicated there were significantly less, both from budget and from looking at what we had spent on average the last several years. And that's the kind of comparison I did that you see in the report, not just against budget, because the budget can tend to be a little conservative to make sure that we're allowing for unknowns. So I also compared it to a 5-year average of what we'd actually spent in a typical year, the last 5 years, and found that costs in those categories were significantly down because we simply were avoiding unnecessary travel, or it just wasn't possible. So when I added all that up, if I compare it to a 5-year average in total with all those categories, it was about $190,000 in cost reductions. So if you look at the unexpected costs that we incurred due to COVID versus the cost savings, even if I take into account some of those things I didn't include in that $108,000 and say there's some other costs that we simply haven't identified, you know, we've broken even, or we've actually benefited in the short term. So that's sort of the context of 2020. And then we were looking at 2021 and what needs do we still have, what costs are still coming that haven't been dealt with, and how to apply this Safe Restart grant. And really what was identified, 3 main proposals came to us when we discussed were, well, I guess I started off in my presentation, the kinds of expenses that that were outlined in the letter when we received the grant, because there was some criteria put into the kinds of expenses we could do. And this summarizes it. It's not comprehensive, but generally they're saying use it for operational purposes to cover those revenue shortfalls where you've got fixed costs, but you haven't had the variable revenues that come in normally. You can apply this money to offset those and keep your facilities financially sustainable. You can use it to cover unexpected costs to safely reopen public facilities and provide operational services. So again, if you look at erecting physical barriers, signage, perhaps changing some of the layout or things that are necessary to be able to have a reception area to provide library services, and so on. Example of that would be the cost that we incurred for moving from having the library shut down to doing a curbside service before we fully reopened them to the public. So there's materials and things that need to be paid for and put in place for that. Technology costs, and this is one I did actually reach out to some of my peers at other regional districts, and this is one of the common themes I saw was using this fund to catch up and improve on technology. A lot of what's been put in place wasn't put in place with a lot of remote access or virtual attendance at meetings. And so, you know, they need to essentially improve the sustainability, the capabilities, the reliability and security for those things to take place properly. So a lot of what I saw at other regional districts when I asked was we're using it towards improving our technology. Fire protection services, other protective services, bylaws. These were things that were highlighted in the letter that this could apply to. Something that very rarely we see in grant funding. Fire departments, as you know, very rarely supported with grant funding. So towards PPE, training required and so forth. And they do allow it to be used towards services for vulnerable populations was one of the things highlighted. If you think about a homeless shelter in the winter, you know, making sure that those spaces have proper social distancing and barriers in place to make them safe would have required a lot of extra costs. And they've also said that, you know, in this case, you can provide that money to a third party, to a not-for-profit group who's providing such a service. If the local government's not doing it themselves, but maybe the mission or the Red Cross or something is providing a services like that, you can provide them with the funding for that service. And they also said, other related costs tend to be very broad. But we've also had some back and forth with the province on, well, can you be a little bit more specific? We don't want to be offside and sort of spend money on something only to find out that that wasn't what the province wanted to see happen. And so they've given us a little bit more clarity. This, basically it's meant to be operations of the local government, limited circumstances where capital projects might apply. If it's directly related to a COVID related problem. So, they gave us a little bit more clarity around that. And one of the things that was mentioned to me, because again, there's been a lot of discussion about, well, these criteria are so broad, you could pretty much do it on anything. And the response that came back from the ministry was, we're not looking to claw back any of this if we disagree with how it's used, but it will be taken into account next time you apply for funding. So I think we need to keep that in mind. So I'll just be a minute to finish up and then we can take questions. So some of the requirements here, the board must allocate grant funds by the end of this year. Doesn't mean they need to be all spent, but they need to be allocated for what the intended use is. And we must report every year on the funds received, how the funds were used, and what the remaining unspent balance of funds is. And they anticipate us doing that as a schedule on the audited financial statements. Interestingly enough, they said we didn't need to have that schedule audited. They weren't looking to have this information audited, but just putting it onto the audited financial statements was a convenient way of reporting it. So really 3 areas that we as staff, having done the information gathering with our various departments, where we're suggesting these funds could be allocated. The first, fire department, they did put together a proposal for us, and it was attached to the report of things they need to feel that they're being supported to operate the volunteer fire department safely. Their proposal was $70,000. It included some one-time expenses, but most of it is consumables that will need to be renewed. And probably, the way things are going, I'm expecting really these needs are going to extend past 2021. So my recommendation is $150,000, a little more than double, to fund both 2021 and 2022. The second piece is, again, the information technology backbone. Our manager of information services, Randy Castle, put together a fairly comprehensive proposal on what he thought needed to be improved with the backbone of our information technology system. Again, to make sure that we've got the right firewalls, routing, security, reliability in place in order to make sure that we can continue having virtual attendance at meetings, remote access, live streaming, things of that nature. And actually, interestingly enough, day before yesterday, we had our internet connection fail. And I believe it was because we had a number of staff working from home. I haven't verified this yet, but this is the rumor. A lot of people working from home. And again, the system wasn't initially designed to allow for that, and it broke. And then the last thing that has been a topic that we've circled around a little bit with the board, but we haven't had specific direction from the board on yet, is construction of a new, larger boardroom. Initial research is showing probably, to construct the room, put in all the correct technology that we would want in terms of presentations and so forth, somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000. So my recommendation is to reserve the remainder of that for that purpose. Not to say that the board's committing to doing this, because I know that there are other proposals being considered, whether we look at, a joint boardroom with other jurisdictions, the school board or what have you, or whether whatever the decision is. But if the board decides that this is the option they want to pursue, then the funding is in place. I will say as well, you may recall from the January meeting, we have applied for grant funding that would encompass this as well, but we don't know yet whether that grant's successful. So I'm thinking of this as kind of plan B. If the grant is successful and the board decides that's the purpose that they want to use those funds, then we can meet again to talk about this 412 and reconsider what other uses it could be put to. If the grant's unsuccessful, I kind of like having this as a plan B to ensure the funding's there to allow the board, you know, for us to execute what the board decides. And that's really what's encompassed in the recommendation. And that's my presentation. So if there's any questions.
Thanks, Mr. Ray. Director Stamer has a question for you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks very much, Doug. Just a question on this COVID PPE equipment for $70,000. How come some of the other fire departments weren't listed as well? Typically the Barrier Fire Department. I mean, we're on a joint fund with TNRD as well. How come we're not going to receive any of that?
And that's a really good question. The ones that were requested funding for were the ones that the TNRD fully administers. The other fire departments have, and maybe we could have broadened the ask a little bit. None of the member municipalities have gotten in touch with me and said, we feel like, you know, we're incurring additional costs. The COVID Safe Restart funds that the municipalities received separate from the TNRD funding, we would like the TNRD to contribute as well.
So you're saying we didn't ask for it, so we don't get it?
I'm saying, well, what I'm saying is that this is what was asked for. So this is what I'm bringing in front of the board. If you feel that there should be broader, then that's part of the discussion today.
Great answer, thanks.
Yeah.
Great answer.
Director Schaefer.
My personal opinion is that this whole thing should go to the EA directors because this money came to the TNRD. Each municipality got their money and they're making their decisions. I think the EA directors should make the decisions on this and then bring it to the board. And I can put that in motion if you'd like.
Did either Mr. Ray or Mr. Hildebrand wish to respond to that suggestion?
Yeah, I'd like to say this. The money that came in to the TNRD came to the TNRD as a whole. And it's very similar in some ways to the federal gas tax we received. The municipalities received their own federal gas tax. They received their own federal, or not federal, but the COVID-19 Safe Restart grant funding. And in the letter, it actually said that it was in some ways disproportionately pushing a little bit more money towards the municipalities because they realized that they might have bigger problems to deal with. If we carve out this money and say, really, because it came to the TNRD, it's only meant for the electoral areas, it creates a real difficult, like handcuffs me to deal with problems that the TNRD has that aren't strictly rural problems. So as an example, if we decide that some of this money should be put towards a new boardroom, really all of the areas in the TNRD, it's the responsibility of the civic building and so on, it's the responsibility of all the areas, not just the rural areas. However, it would put me in a situation pretty much the opposite of what Director Stamer just talked about. If we want to fund that, and now we're going to say the money coming from this fund is only coming from the rural areas, that puts me in a position of going hat in hand to each municipality and saying, you know, the board wants to do this, and I have to come to you and ask you for some of your money separate from this fund. When I think about what the decision making was at the province and federal level, they don't understand that, right? They don't understand the kind of equity issues that arise from having 21 different jurisdictions within a regional district. They just said, we know that local governments are having problems because of COVID, and we're just going to give all the local governments money. So they're not giving it to the TNRD with the thought of saying, we're going to create So this big equity issue for you. They're giving it to us saying, you've got a problem, here's some money, go fix it. And so my preference is to keep it simple and simply say, this is money that was provided to the TNRD to provide a financial solution to COVID created problems. And it should be used that way without creating a lot of equity issues internally.
Okay, thank you, Director Christian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No problem with number one. In fact, I think maybe it's a low estimate in terms of what's needed for our fire departments. And in particular, I think we should focus on training and infection control, particularly for our rescue services, highway rescue, things like that. Maybe not as much for suppression, but I think that's a low estimate. I also think it's a low estimate for the IT requirements and this sort of digital strategy. I think the pandemic has really advanced that much more quickly than we would have naturally. And I think we need to catch up with both hardware and software and training for that. My concern is with the boardroom piece. You know, we're in this room because we needed to be in a space that was going to be compliant with WorkSafe's requirement for physical distancing. And to quote Bonnie Henry, this is not forever, this is just for now. So to predicate the fact that the pandemic has caused us a requirement to build a new boardroom, I think is a bit of a stretch. I think after the pandemic ends, or after we get herd immunity through vaccination, and many of us were on a call yesterday about vaccination, we are going to be able to get back into those rooms that have served us well for many, many years and will continue to. And so I think to say that because of the pandemic, we're going to have to build a new boardroom for ever and ever is like saying because of the pandemic, we've got to change the BC Legislative Assembly and make it much bigger, right? I think this will be over, and I'm hoping by 2022, at the start of the year, we'll be quite back to normal and able to resume where we had left off in March of last year.
Noted, Director Singh.
I'll wait, Mr. Chair. I'll wait.
Director Rice was, has his
Okay,
hand.
Director Rice.
Thank you. And now I'm going to return the favor to Director Christian and agree with him totally on the boardroom. For one thing, public perception is a lot, and they're going to spin it to buy ourselves a new boardroom with the COVID startup funds. Just sounds really bad. And besides that, I just agree with everything else Director Christian just said. On that note, however, it should be noted that this funding was allocated at $3.10 per total population of the regional district, which in my estimation about 133,000. So about $410,000 was allocated based on the total population. The balance of that was per capita, was based on the rural population outside all the municipal boundaries at $8.13 per person. So though maybe we don't have to give all the money to the electoral areas, this money was intended at $8.13 per person in the electoral areas to go to the electoral areas. And in here, my problem is I don't see any stream into the directorial areas that's transparent. And we also have, which we discussed in the strategic plan, is a perception problem with little small rural communities. And here is an opportunity to address that strategic plan concern by maybe funneling some of this money, say to the community halls or the volunteer societies or some brigades out here in the rural areas. And I think with the scope, we should be able to do that. So if the Friends of Wallace Sheen or the 16 Mile Fire Brigade Volunteer Society get $5,000, that matches or exceeds their existing cash on hand. And what a great statement it makes from the TNRD to actually reach out, be transparent with that reach out so people know what we're doing. I just think we need to see some of this money and see the stream that gets it into these rural areas, because that's what it was intended to do. That's it.
Thank you. Director Roden.
Thank you, Chair Gillis. To pick up on what Director Rice said and what Director Christian said, I think the optics of setting aside $412,000 for a new boardroom is going to be one of those ones. It's going to be really difficult to explain satisfactorily to the general public at this time. And I totally agree with Director Rice. I think that some of the money should go directly to the electoral areas and to the small communities. A lot of these small communities have had to transition on the fly from doing what they normally do to doing things like providing meals for people, connecting people up with support services, picking up groceries, medications, mail, taking them to hospital appointments, all these things that people are doing out of the goodness of their heart in a lot of cases and on a shoestring budget. And I think it would behoove the regional district to put some of this money directly back at that grassroots level. $5,000 for most of these community organizations would be enormous. They are very, very canny with their money, and they are able to make it go a very long way. And a lot of that money is spent on the local level. So I think that it would just be a good idea to direct or set aside some of this funding for the EA directors to use at their discretion in their electoral areas where it would do the most good and be seen to do the most good.
Thank you. Director Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that actually the question that I had for Mr. Ray, first off, is about additional cleaning and increased costs around cleaning. That was one of the things that was flagged by our administration as a fairly expensive item that has had quite an increase. So I just wondered if that was one of the things that perhaps might have been recognized by staff as one of the major increase costs directly related to COVID. So that was just a question I had. And then the other comment I wanted to make is I do agree that it's not necessarily the best thing for us to be allocating that kind of money to a new boardroom, because hopefully we will exist in some sort of a normal situation again here in the near future. The other thing I just wanted to mention, some of the other directors have mentioned some of the smaller rural areas, and I wouldn't have an issue in creating a grant fund of some kind that some of those smaller groups can access. Some of them may be struggling with technology and things like that of their own that they don't have funding for. So I would support perhaps a grant fund set aside specifically for groups like that to apply to. So that was it for me. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Director Smith. Director Stamer.
Excuse me, Chair. Could I just respond to the question that Director
No, sorry. No, by all means.
asked regarding cleaning? Yeah, as I said, a lot of the costs that were reflected there, that 108,000 in the report, had to do with PPE and cleaning supplies and disinfection type stuff. The other aspect of the cleaning is, you may recall, I believe it was in September, we entered into a new contract for janitorial for the civic building. And, you know, by that time of year, we anticipated probably an enhanced level of service necessary. And that was built into the RFP that we put out. There were additional, not just frequency of cleaning, but the depth of cleaning and so on that was built into that contract. So that was kind of taken care of through that contract. It was a more expensive contract than the previous contract. I think the difference in price was close to $50,000.
Okay,
Thank you.
Great. Director Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And one thing I wanted to say about this province coming back to us after the fact and saying there are now parameters around that other related cost. I think that's a little bit tough to kind of swallow in a way, because a lot of communities already spent that money. And if they kind of look at us and in the hindsight and say they're going to try to call back future grants, that's a tough thing to hear. So I would encourage some pushback around that, because ultimately we're all trying to do the best we can in a situation. Now, I'm speaking as a municipal director of the district. I'm not speaking for myself, but I really think that Director Schaefer's idea has some merit in terms of looking at areas of in the regional district that don't have pots of money of their own. And I would certainly say if we went to a EA directors kind of committee meeting and they took actually all the requests, not just requests from EA director, but everybody, I have faith it would come back in a way to the board that actually would work with everybody. So I trust my colleagues who are EA directors to actually look at the concerns of Barrier or Ashcroft or Clearwater or whoever who may need the funds more than the city of Kamloops needs it, right? But I really think that rural economic sustainability, rural work is been really damaged by the pandemic in many ways. So, you know, I would express some support for her direction there. I'm not sure if she's going to bring up his motion or not, but I mean, I think it would be interesting. And I don't think, Mr. Ray, that means that it doesn't come back to the board. I think we're saying it would come back to the board as recommendations, that we would be finally our decision. But, you know, someone has to do the kind of heavy lifting. And I would say that EA directors in this case would be the best place, in my view, to do it. So I'm adding some support for that. Whether it goes, it goes. But I think that makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Thank you, Director Kershaw.
Thank you. Well, I hate to go against the strain, but I'm adamantly in favor of us building our own boardroom. We needed it whether we were into a pandemic or not. The boardroom was too small. We didn't have facilities to use, anything else. So we built a proper boardroom rather than renting a spot over at the hotel across the Delta Hotel or anything else. We would have a facility of our own that we could utilize. It could be utilized for many other aspects of it, that rather than just a boardroom. The other one is going to be too small, no matter how we look at it. I like the idea of these grant funds going into the regional areas. And I have to point out that most of in the rural areas, the Barriers, the Clearwaters, most of the little municipalities, they receive funds of their own. So I saw at LGLA, they said to put funds into these other services have to be owned by we only own 2 or 3 community halls up and down the North Thompson. But to put it a good shot into putting our own facility to have our own boardroom, maybe get some grant funds that we weren't going to be using for other things, the iTech and that. We could put a good shot into that, which for the small communities would be able to get $5,000 if they needed, the little forts, the small little communities. But we're not covering the municipalities that receive there. One way or the other, we're going to have to put monies into the boardroom, whether we pay for it from the taxpayers' dollars or put a good sum into there, change that, and we needed the room anyway. So I'm totally in favor of us putting in our own boardroom into our own building so we can go back the way we were. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Kershaw. Director Quinn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A quick question to Ms. Campbell. We have a recommendation with 3 items in it. Can that be severed in any way, shape, or form?
Yeah, you can vote on them individually, or you can move a totally different recommendation. No one's moved any of them yet. So
Thank you.
yeah.
I'd be prepared to support A and B. And on C, I want some more time to think about it. There's been good points made on both sides. And I looked at this before I came in last week, or when I read the thing, and I'm still not completely sure on where it's supposed to go. And I frankly would like some more time to think about it. So I would be prepared to move a motion to approve A and B, and sets. I said prepared. Does that mean it is a motion? Okay, thank you. I'd support A and B then, Mr. Chairman, and set C aside for further discussion a little later. So I don't think we have to spend it this year. Is that correct, Mr. Ray?
It doesn't need to be spent this year. Just by the end of this year, we need to have an idea where we want to spend it.
Thank you. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair Gillis, could you add Director Brown and Director Bass as well to your list? I believe they.
Sorry, to the speaker list.
And just a note, we have a motion on the floor now. So.
Yeah, I'm aware we have a motion on the floor. So at this point, I guess what we have to do is move from this general discussion to a discussion on the motion on the floor. Am I not correct? Okay, so there's a motion on the floor and discussion. Director Stamer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It kind of leads into what I was going to ask in the first place, and that I agree with Director Rice and his, talking about the way the formula was put together. And Director Christian had some really good points at the beginning of the discussion, and Director Roden as well, with some of the needs in some of the smaller communities. And I'm just curious if, and back to the boardroom, and I agree with Director Kershaw in as much as that we probably need something different than what we have, but is there a way that we could say take $100,000 out of that 412? I know we're talking A and B, but could we take $100,000 out of that 412 and give the area directors 50,000, similar to what Director Singh is talking about, so that maybe they could identify in that group back to the board in maybe some of those areas in their electoral areas that could use some of that on the ground help, 50,000 this year, 50,000 next year, and let them come back to the board with their recommendation, and then still have 312 towards the end of the year, determining whether we want to use that for board money or something else. That gives them an opportunity to get 50,000 this year, possibly 50,000 next year, or maybe spend it by the end of the year for those smaller rural communities that they know only too well that there's a need out there.
So you're suggesting $5,000 per director?
Yes.
There's 10 electoral areas. If you take $50,000, that's five.
It's not a lot of money, but it's some.
May I break in on a point of order, Mr. Chairman? We're talking about A and B, not C. Should either be talking about that and either passing it or defeating it, and then talk about the
Just
other
point
one.
I think Director Stamer's comments would have been leading to an amendment to your motion, Director Quinn.
It also, if I may, it also impacts the total amount, Director Quinn, and that we're dealing about dicing up to 947. So that's why I wanted to say, it does have an implication on what we spend in those two amounts. That's why I wanted to add that to that discussion. It is totally separate, but it's part of the 947.
It is certainly confusing the issue, however, and
I think it's,
Yep.
may I interrupt? Sorry. I
Yeah.
think it's cleaner with Director Stamer, if we deal with what Director Stamer is suggesting separately from what Director Quinn has proposed.
thanks. I was about to suggest that. When we finish with Director Quinn's motion, it seems to me, Ms. Campbell, if it passes, that leaves the $412,000 up for further discussion, and that would be an appropriate time for Director Stamer to, okay. We're discussing Director Quinn's motion. Director Elliott?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ray, what about the rural fire departments that we do not own as a TNRD? Like, because this is supposed to be to help our rural areas, we have fire departments that also need PPE and have had extra training, have done extra things because of COVID, and yet you're not proposing that we haven't give them any money, and they are part of the TNRD whether we own them or not.
So 2 points on that. One, and this maybe goes against the popular opinion, but it seems to me that the provincial government and the federal government frequently uses a per capita formula to decide who's going to get money when they want to spread it around. I don't think that parallels to say it's intended for the rural areas only. It's just a convenient formula for them to figure out how much each local government's going to get. When they give the money to the TNRD, it's for the TNRD as a whole. That's my opinion. But secondly, you may recall several years ago, the board had arrived at a decision that we would not fund rural fire departments that we did not oversee the operations of. And so there's fire departments that came under our operational control that we can continue funding. But at that time, we gave them a window. So there's, I think, one remaining fire department that was receiving an annual grant and aid that's going to expire soon. And beyond that, we said when it came to brigades or other fire departments that weren't under our operational control, the board had said no funding.
Well, and Mr. Ray, I agree with that. However, this is money given to us as a regional district because of the COVID. That's got nothing to do with the tax dollars that we collect for fire departments. And when you have individual little fire departments like we have in small rural communities or brigades or whatever, they should be, I mean, are we going to then give part of this $150,000 to the city of Kamloops to barrier? And I mean, if that's the process, then we deserve to have some for the areas that are not owned by the regional district in the rural areas.
It's a good point. I guess all I was stating was what our past direction from the board was.
Director O'Reilly.
Thank you. On B, the investment of $385,000, are you forecasting a savings in operational cost due to that investment of $400,000 in the IT infrastructure you're talking about?
No.
Director Singh.
Just on the IT cost too, Ms. Ray, there's some licensing costs and stuff. I think it's 65% of the funds actually ongoing. So after COVID money is over, does that get rolled over into taxes?
That's a good question. So some of the licensing and so on, it becomes a question that I don't know the answer to in terms of what the future behavior is going to be. Is the board still going to consider having people virtually attend meetings after COVID is no longer an issue? Are we going to continue to have more public meetings held with a virtual technology as opposed to always being in person? I think there are going to be continuing needs regardless of COVID.
I guess the way to handle that is probably to say, if that does become continuing, they'll come back to the board as this is sort of a discrete, whatever, couple year process. I would imagine that if it gets if the idea is to roll it over and actually the annual budget, then it would come back to the board for approval for that. Was that correct?
Yeah, or at the very least, I would highlight it as part of the budget process.
Mr. Hildebrand.
Chair Gillis, I know that Director Brown, Director Rothenberger, and Director Rice now, and also Director Bass were on the list as well.
Yes, they're all on my list. They were on the list before
so I wasn't sure
Director Quinn made his motion. So I would be asking them and everybody else if there's further discussion with respect to Director Quinn's motion. And then I expect that depending on the result of Director Quinn's motion, it may obviate the necessity for some of the other comments. Is there any further discussion with respect to the motion by Director Quinn?
Director Bass and Director Rice.
Director Bass?
Thank you. In terms of the discussion about continuing with the virtual public hearings, we just had a discussion earlier about engaging the public and having them learn more about what the TNRD does. And that's another way of helping people who cannot come to Kamloops for the meetings or cannot come to wherever we go when we do leave the city to learn more about what the TNRD does. And that's a good thing. That could encourage more people to run for the board, more people to be engaged with it, more people to actually look and see what's going on our website. So I would like to see us continue with that.
Thank you, Director Rice.
Thank you, Chair. And this is Doug staff, I believe. Given the technology piece, the 385, whatever, I'm just wondering if there was any thought given or if there could be some thought given to the technology piece of actually reaching out to our, COVID has really created a problem with an online presence and stuff like that, because most of these small businesses and places, they have to, for instance, restaurants have to put menus on their websites, and places that have product to sell, they have to go online and try to sell them to make a living and stay open during COVID and stuff like that. And because small rural businesses are mostly run like older people like myself and have really crummy websites like ours, that don't have an administrator that knows how to administrate. I'm just wondering if some of that technology money could be, if we don't build a boardroom, which I'm hoping we don't, but that's to be decided later. We could use some of that money maybe to an outreach to some of these small businesses and help them at this point in time. Because I think what COVID has impacted is the ability to work from home, and that includes businesses. Work from your business, and there's no menus being handed out in restaurants, for instance. You got to go use your phone, and if you go to a website, the menu's got to be on the website. And so I'm just wondering if there's any thought put into that.
Mr. Ray, I thought that you had discussed earlier the parameters around which this funding came to us, and that it specifically excluded businesses. Am I missing something?
No, you're right. And I'm trying to think of it, not to say that what Director Rice is proposing is a bad idea at all. It probably is a definite need. I'm just not sure it fits in with the criteria that the province established for use of these funds. What the $100,000 or $385,000 that's in the motion currently be discussed was the proposal brought forward by our head of IT, what he thought he needed for us to run our operations more securely, more consistently, more reliably, as they're currently operating, as they need to operate in the foreseeable future. To take some money and put it to outside parties, I agree. I need to give it some thought as to how it fits in with the criteria, if it does. But secondly, I think that would have to come out of the remaining funds, not out of the 385 that's currently being discussed as part of this motion.
No, I agree with that, Doug. And let me follow up, please. And follow up, please, on that, because I totally agree with that, Doug. It needs to come out. And just, if you could just do a little research into that and see if that would qualify, that's a difference maker for small rural businesses. And so it's worth at least having that conversation. And to be honest with you, I think the 10 electoral areas need to have a sort of an electoral area meeting and have a discussion too before, we wrap this up at some point.
Ms. Campbell?
Sorry, I just wanted to comment from a legislative perspective. So there's actually a general prohibition against providing assistance to businesses in the community charter, except within certain circumstances, of which this probably unfortunately would not be one. There's ways of not getting around it, but there's ways of not violating that prohibition in the legislation. But we'd have to look into it further, but essentially that there's that prohibition. So I unfortunately don't think that something like this would be permissible under our local government legislation.
Thanks. Director Brown, did you wish to comment on Director Quinn's motion, or?
I'm not sure anymore which one I'm commenting on, because we seem to be all over the map on both of them anyways, but I do understand that this fund is not used for directly to business. And as Deanna had mentioned, there are prohibitions against it elsewhere. But I also know that both federal and provincial grants and funding and all sorts of programming are available for people affected with COVID. And I don't have a problem with looking at trying to put some kind of program or fund together for us to be able to use. But I have difficulty with it going directly to organizations. With A and B for Director Quinn's motion, I'm fine with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion on Director Quinn's motion? And perhaps have Ms. Campbell read the motion back, so that, because we do seem to have been wandering around here.
I believe Director Rothenberger had a comment.
Director Rothenberger, go ahead, please.
I was actually going to ask for the motion to be read again, because I've lost track of whether my question has anything to do with the motion or not. It might or it might not.
Sure, it's fairly straightforward. It's just that the committee recommend that the board approve allocation. Well, actually, sorry, the committee recommend that the board approve the COVID-19 Safe Restart Grant funds as follows. So that 150,000 to TNRD Fire Protection Services and the 385,000 to TNRD Information Technology Services. And we've left out C to be dealt with at another time.
I think that's what he said, that the 412,000 be set aside for future consideration. Is that not correct?
That's correct. Director Rothenberger, does that answer your question? Do you have another question?
Well, yes, I think the question I was going to ask fits with the discussion, the way the motion is worded, and it goes back to Director Elliott's comments or questions about fire brigade funding. So the simple question, I think, is, does the source of funding, in other words, not local taxpayers, alter the TNRD's concerns about potential liability if we fund fire brigades? Or can this funding be possibly directed towards fire brigades? And I think that's basically the same question Director Elliott was asking, but I'm not clear on what the answer might be.
It's a good question, Director Rothenberger. I think I need some time to look into it and get back to you on that, but it is a good question.
Well, given the, yeah, thank you. I'd really appreciate that, because given the problems and challenges faced by fire brigades, particularly since the TNRD banned any further funding to them, this would be a lot of interest to me, and I would think other EA directors as well. Thanks.
Sure. How about we look into it and then we can bring the information to the EA committee meeting in March.
Call the question.
Director.
My question.
Okay, Director Rain.
I'm really sure there's way too many questions. I'd like to table this discussion.
Director Rain.
I think I moved to call the question ahead of that.
I believe you did. Yeah. So I will call the question now.
No, but do you have to vote on calling the question, Mr. Chair?
Pardon?
Mr. Chair, do you have to, is there some sort of vote by the board to actually call the question, or do we have to call the question? Is it the chair's decision? I was wondering.
I believe it's at the chair's discretion.
Sorry, thank you.
So with respect to Director Quinn's motion that the 150 for fire protection services go ahead, the 385 for IT services go ahead, and the 412 be set aside for future consideration. Sorry.
I just want to also just clarify that this is, since we're sitting in committee, this is just a recommendation that the board approve this. So this will go to the board again, and if you want to deal with it and debate it again at a board meeting, we can do that.
Yeah, and I think that the preamble there says that recommend that the board approve. It doesn't say that we're approving. We're recommending that the board should approve when the board again convenes, correct? Thank you. So all in favor? Opposed, if any?
I'm going to just read it out loud for the benefit of our recording secretary. We have Director Kershaw opposed, Director Elliott, Director Schaefer, Director Watson. Is there anyone else on Zoom that I'm not seeing that's opposed? Okay, thank you.
And that was how many, Ms. Campbell, opposed?
4. No.
5?
Oh, Director Rice, are you opposed?
Director Rice is opposed,
Okay.
apparently.
5.
So the motion is carried. Now, Mr. Hildebrand, there's a luncheon.
Mr. Chair, if I may, just quickly.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, on the, so the motion was A and B, but then you added something around a C around the 412 for other consideration. I thought that we were actually going to deal with that separately, or deal with some other process separately for that recommendation. So one thing I wanted to wonder about, if I may, is I'm still thinking about how to get, I would really appreciate getting electoral area directors' feedback on the rest of that money. And I think that is there a way that we can ask EA directors to actually, you know, if they have a committee or a group that can kind of meet and talk about, you know, the rest of that money and kind of see where it kind of goes from there, because I do think that's an important context for the board to, you know, to have when we make the decision at the board meeting we're going to make decisions on. So I'm not sure the process around that, but that to me would make a lot of sense.
Thanks, Director Quinn.
Actually, item C wasn't in the original motion. And I was going to make a second motion that item C be referred to the electoral area directors meeting on March the 11th, I think it is. And that gives that's what the motion is. And speaking to that motion, it's obvious there's some confusion as I am. I'd like a little bit more information on what it can and can't be used for. I'm sure all the electoral area directors feel the same. We have a scheduled meeting and then we can kick it back around and then bring it back. And it may go, we may decide C is a good thing to put in the boardroom, but I wouldn't be prepared to make that decision today. That's why I made the motion. Thank you.
Well, Director Quinn, my comment on that is that it has not yet been determined that this is funding that is exclusive unto the electoral areas, and that so I'm going to speak in opposition to your motion because I don't think it's very clear that this is electoral area money exclusively. So I'll hear other comments on that. Director Singh.
Mr. Again, this is board money, but I think that the way that's framed is a bit too narrow. I think it's not the boardroom. I think I would like to see discussion on other uses of that money as well, whether they be, you know, rural community halls or fire brigades or what have you. But, you know, from my perspective, this will come back to the board anyways. And municipalities have our money for things. And I see a lot of municipalities putting that money, in fact, in the reserves because we can't spend it all this year. Now, we're going to spend it all because I think there'll be a need for it going forward. So, you know, I really think that from my perspective as a real district director and having decision-making, you know, one of the 26 around the table, it's useful to hear from folks who would have probably more use for the money than we would as in our particular jurisdictions. I mean, obviously there's corporate money for IT and for the prior stuff that we already passed as recommendations to the full board. But I think it's really important to hear that. And I think the motion, hopefully the motion Director Quinn is actually putting forward is not just a boardroom, it's actually a larger set, but he's framed it as a boardroom. So I'm not sure whether that gives handcuffs or that gives an allowance. Maybe Ms. Campbell can talk to that.
I was just gonna recommend, Director Quinn, if you're okay with it, that it just be that the 412, the remaining portion be referred to the EA committee for discussion.
That was the intent of the motion.
Okay, perfect.
And that discussion will come back to the board anyway, but there seems to be all
Perfect.
sorts of opinions all over the place. That's why I moved that motion. A number of electoral directors said that they would like to look at it that way. Some have not. And to me, that's a sensible way of handling it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Any further discussion? Director Stamer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just, I guess, just for clarification on why the motion is there in the first place. Because, I mean, I think Director Singh has just mentioned that it's part of the pot and we're not trying to, you know, pit area directors versus municipal, and we're not going to start looking at a formula that, you know, municipal got $4 and rural got $8. I'm not sure what the purpose of the motion is for.
Ms. Campbell.
Well, I mean, something needs to be moved and seconded to be referred to a committee. So it's being discussed right now. So my belief is that a motion would be appropriate in order to allow the EA directors to talk about this pot of money.
And that's what I thought I put on the table.
You did.
Thank
That's
you.
my understanding. Yeah.
And that means that the electoral areas meeting, they would discover this. I've had enough.
They would discuss and
the
debate, yep.
$412,000, but that does not by any manner of means mean that it is their $412,000 to spend. It's just that it would be under discussion at that time. Am I correct?
That's correct.
That's what I meant. That was the intent of the motion.
Yeah, maybe they might put forward some recommendations to bring forward to a future committee of the whole or the board.
One of which might be put it to the boardroom. So there's obviously a division in the room. And to me, that seems that it's the obvious way to do it is sit back, take some time. I know we need some more, so we need some questions answered.
Okay.
Then we can come back and talk about it.
Thank you.
Don't have to spend it tomorrow.
Thanks, Director Quinn. Director Elliott?
I just find it incredible that we would take a bunch of money that was prepared for the whole board and ask the EA directors for a recommendation. That's just dumb.
Thank you for your comment. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed, if any?
Okay, I'm going to read it out.
2.
Director Elliott opposed, Director Duty opposed, Director Kershaw opposed, Director O'Reilly opposed, Director Christian opposed, Director Smith opposed, Director Bass opposed, Director Sinclair opposed, Director Brown opposed, and Director Swan opposed.
I wasn't using my fingers. How many is that? I think it's a
I'm
majority.
going to ask the recording secretary to count. Christian? That's 10.
10 opposed?
Mhm. Oh, do you want to poll again? Am I like? Sure. Okay. Marty, can you please? Okay. Do you want me to just call it again for
Yeah,
everybody to say?
with respect to Director Quinn's motion, all
those
all in favor.
opposed, please put your oppose. We were asking who was opposed, so please put your hands up again, and I'm going to poll again.
Okay.
And I'm going to count. Director Elliott, Director Duty, Director Kershaw, Director O'Reilly, Director Christian, Director Swan, Director Brown, Director Smith, Director Bass, Director Sinclair. That's 10. That's correct. 10.
That's 10. So the motion passes.
Correct.
All right, that takes us to,
Should we break, Chair? We have some
Yeah.
lunch here for everybody. Maybe
I
we
think
can
so,
eat
yeah.
while we listen to the next
it was,
presentation.
I'm sorry, it was suggested to me that we could just grab a sandwich and then continue with the
Yes.
meeting, and I think that might.
Actually, it's a brown bag, and just out of respect for those online that won't get a brown bag lunch, we could actually just bring it to you and we can continue. We've got a 15-minute presentation and we're done. So it's up to you, Chair.
Can you send? Skip
Brown
the
bag
dates?
that'll wait for 15 minutes?
Take a few moments and let them grab food. I'm
Okay.
worried people are gonna fade for the last presentation.
Once you have your food, I'm happy to talk while you chew.
We'll have less to say back to you, Regina.
Are you going to give us lots to chew on, Regina?
I'm gonna give you something to chew on.
Still haven't got anything back from
Yeah, I just need a little legal review. Make sure I got the other side down.
Where's my friend? Yes.
Where's the chair? I know, it's like one extreme to the other. I'm just waiting for the chair. Yeah. Where'd he go? All right, with that, while you enjoy your lunch, I will scoot ahead. So I am here to, does it work? No, let's try this. Okay. Are you sure it's not frozen? Oh, there we go. So I am here to take about 15 minutes of your time to highlight. I have 20 slides. I'm only providing the highlights of our 2020 monitoring report. This was in your January agenda package. You don't have the PowerPoint. Are the folks online? Can they see this? Great. Okay. And I wanted to apologize. There is one error in your printed version. There's a 2 and a 3 reversed, and I hope you all found it. No. All right. So just where have we been? Our RGS is celebrated 20 years now. We are not doing full monitoring reports every year because it's just too much work. We do it off the corner of our desks in the office. We sometimes contract out little portions of it where we collect primary data. Our next major report, this was like a sub-report again because we're waiting for the census data. And we wanted to do one because it's overdue. In 2022, we will do a fulsome report because we'll have the 2021 data, but also we are overdue for an RGS review. We're supposed, nobody looks at them every 5 years really, but you're supposed to, and it's time to do a review. That said, our RGS is not nearly as stringent and limiting as other ones are in, say, the Okanagan, the Capital Regional District, or the Lower Mainland. So I will be bringing a report to a future committee, the report of the whole this year, looking at a review just to get a sense if there's any appetite to make any changes. So the 10 indicators, there they are, they haven't changed. Sometimes we play with the content. Not all the data is available every year, and some data groups are no longer collected, so we find other relevant data to these 10 indicators, and those were approved by they were set by the board in 2014. There is our census change in the last census period, and I know yesterday with the housing needs we discussed census versus other populations, so that is census data, but we went to the BC stats, which is called an estimate. And an estimate, they base that on a variety of sources, everything from care card, your health care registration with the province, your driver's license, what have you. You can see there the blue is Thompson-Nicola, the whole regional district. I broke out Kamloops because it's the big fish. And then the EA areas are the green. And we've also, over that same 10-year span, so this data went right up to data we got from the province for 2019. You can see what's happening as a percentage. That's the magenta in British Columbia, and the blue is TNRD. So BC is fairly steady at about anywhere from 1.5 to almost 2% increase, whereas the TNRD, we're up and down. Oops, going the wrong way. Our second indicator looks at where the housing is being developed. Here, what we look at is where is there new housing developed in rural areas. So going from 2010 to 2019, that shouldn't say BC. What is that? Oh, sorry, it's EC, established communities. Sorry, my vision. What we're looking there is, where are people building houses? Are they building them on rural lands in the back of beyond, or in areas where there's no water or service, sewers or fire services? Or are they building in places like improvement districts, or places where, say for Pritchard, so Pritchard, Savanaugh, Spence's Bridge, Tobiano, those are all established communities in the rural areas. So we want to see that go up. We want people to build where there's existing properties and services versus spreading out through the whole countryside. So you can see generally, from a low of about 15–20%, that is generally going up. So that indicator is moving in the right direction as regards the policies we have in the RGS. Oops. Here you see those are all housing starts, and I believe that's last year. And the vast majority, 60% of them, are within a 50-kilometer commute of Kamloops. So those folks are typically driving to Kamloops for work, shopping, what have you, because that is a tolerable commute. Then going on to the fourth indicator, economy. And some of this data, because I couldn't go back to the census data, so I got the federal with the ECDEV region of Thompson-Okanagan. So this is a report on the economy that the feds put out in 2018. And the top three growth sectors were healthcare and social assistance, retail, and construction. So this is in the whole area, not just the TNRD, and the top loss was the resource sector. And then I got some fresh data from November 2020. So that would still be during the pandemic, about the unemployment rate for the whole region, Thompson-Okanagan, and then a breakout noting that Kelowna does skew those, the cities of Kelowna and Kamloops would skew the data, but they don't break that down by small municipalities or electoral areas. In terms of employment, this is median individual, so not household or family, but individual annual income. There you see where Kamloops is, where the EAs are trending, and where BC as a whole in the context is trending and moving independently. This graph is in not all of these graphs are in your paper report and attached to your agenda today. And this is the sheet that had the boo-boo, because I got the 2 and the 3 backwards on Kamloops in 2009. And we expect that after some of the major projects we're seeing in the TNRD, that when the census data comes out, there will be some swings in data. Our sixth indicator is environment. In this case, we're focusing on air quality because that has been an issue in our area. There's only one major provincial monitoring station. Of course, they track air quality elsewhere in the TNRD. However, this is the monitoring station on the federal building in downtown Kamloops, and it's the one that tracks the most fulsome real-time data 24 hours a day. And the key indicator here is the parts per million of these small particles. So these are the particles that affect our lungs and our health. They're smaller than 2.5 micrometers. Let me just pull this out. And the red line, the horizontal red line, is the provincial target. And of course, you can see in our region, especially in Kamloops, how extreme it went over the fires of 2017 and 18. And I expect this will be much lower after the lack of all the commuters this year. So again, you can go on to, they have a great website where you can check the data for yesterday or the day before. And we take this and we compare it with, here you have all the stations in British Columbia in 2019, and here's Kamloops. So this is not a wildfire year, significant wildfire year, and we're sort of 1/3 of the way down. And then looking in 2017, Austin, Williams Lake, and what else is there? There's another community. Valemont, we top the charts. So there you have a terrible year and there you have a good year. I would submit that there's a lot of room for improvement. Now looking at the seventh indicator, which is health. So we look at both life expectancy and wellness. We don't have recent census data, so we got data from Interior Health. And of course, the data we used, because the TNRD, and you can see the white outline, and you know this from your hospital district, but we don't perfectly overlap with any local health areas. So we're using the Thompson-Caribou-Shuswap health service delivery area, which is the pink. So that's where this data is from. And you can see where we are with life expectancy in that health service delivery area. We're about 2 years below the BC average. And then you can see it goes all the way back. The data goes back to, sorry, my apologies for the small little letters. 1987. I think I need new glasses. And down at the bottom, the bar graphs are indicators where we're comparing what our wellness indicators are. We used to use obesity because that was what the Healthy Communities folks suggested, because we had an issue with that. They no longer track that. They track wellness. So here we are in the context of all of BC versus our health service delivery area. And unfortunately, we're leading the pack except for in the last one. And the last one where we're below, that's how many folks have a health provider. Going on further about health, this graph shows the standardized mortality ratio. So this would be cause of death in our area as compared to BC. So if you have a number below 1, then that means we have less cancer or less motor vehicle accidents, and it's rated down there so you can see it's 2.6. So our chances of death are 2.6 times higher than the rest of BC as a comparison. Could be the Coca-Cola, not sure, but could be the 5A or the 5. That is not based on visitors driving through. These numbers are keyed into people's primary addresses. So If you look back to the housing, look at the amount of driving that people do in our area. And even if you look at the comments in our housing needs, a lot of rural folks said, we're such a car-driven community, even in a lot of the small towns, except for Chase, but where they have golf carts. With the weather conditions and with the extent of driving, of course, we're much more likely to perish in a motor vehicle accident than other parts of the province. That table is in your, paper copy. Farm incomes, in terms of agriculture, we have 3 different indicators that focus on agriculture. This is census data, so I'm sorry, it's stale dated, but you can see the TNRD generally, other than there was a little bit of a blip in 2011, but the TNRD in BC, we are definitely moving in the right direction. While there's a lot of losses in things like forestry, agriculture and agricultural exports are making up. I'm very curious to see this data for next year, or this year, pardon me, which will come out next year. Now, ag land, this is important data, and we pay a company that specializes in gathering this data. They work for banks and like the Real Estate Foundation and what have you. This is, they looked at all the data going back to 2010, they went right up to last Christmas. So I have this halfway through December, a month and a half or so ago. All the farmland sales. So they looked, and I asked them to break it down per year, comparing us to the Caribou to the Fraser Valley. So these lands are farmlands, meaning that they were assessed as Class 9 farm. How big are they? What did they sell for? The whole property. So if there's a building, a hay barn, or a house, that they don't disaggregate that because they wouldn't know what you're paying for the land versus the building. So these are full property sales. And we break it down by the demarcation of 8 hectares, which is 20 acres. Now, we picked the Caribou because it's a fair comparison, especially for farmlands versus Kelowna, which are typically much smaller. And the Fraser Valley, because we've seen some movement and trends in that direction. So in terms of, now this is farms over 8 hectares, so they're not small lot farms or maybe a small winery. In the TNRD, for those 10 years, this is what they primarily were. So beef vacant, dairy, mixed, other. This graph, I believe, is in your report, so I'm not going to go over the fine little points. Looking what's happening. So that's taking all those parcels. It's like, I think almost 8,000 sales. What's happening with land? Here's the Fraser Valley for Class 9 farmland, and there's us in the Caribou. And there's little blips in, you can see in the TNRD, we were escalating in 2018. We're of such a scale that all it takes is, say if Quilchena Ranch sells to Douglas Lake Ranch, we'll see a big blip. But generally, we are holding steady, but this is all farmlands. So small ones, large ones, the ones up in, by Wells Gray or Vavenby, right down to Nicola Valley or around Kamloops. If you look at so there you have the 3 regional districts. But then if you look at that for TNRD farm sales, the average dollar value per hectare of all parcels averages out, and that's held fairly steady at 9,000 and change. But looking at the ones that are smaller than 8 hectares, so smaller than 20 acres, the price, so this might be some of the smaller lots, say in Cherry Creek or on the South Thompson River, it goes up exponentially to 154,000 and change per hectare. Now, a lot of that might be because it was a beautiful country estate on the land, but if you look at the larger parcels, it jumps way down, and a lot more larger parcels are exchanged to only 7,750 per hectare. That is the order of magnitude that happens with smaller lots, and that really speaks to the viability of ranching. So it's 20 times more costly if you're going to buy farmland of that scale. And that can be the difference between actually even being able to farm. In terms of our second indicator 9 is ALR applications. So we look at all ALR applications, not just in the region, in the rural areas. We look at municipal ones too. For the years 2018 and 2019, almost 59% were for subdivision. And of those ALR applications for subdivision, 3/4 were denied by the ALC. So to get a subdivision approved on ALR farmland is getting harder and harder. The other big chunk, 1/3, were non-farm use. Those have a much better rate of approval, about 50-50. And then you have other ones. Not all of those even come to the board. For example, inclusion ones go straight to the ALC. And I would point out at the bottom, looking at the high point for those small parcels under 20 acres, between 2017 and fresh data just last year in 2020, the increase has been astronomical. And this may have something to do with COVID, but that average went up to over $500,000 per hectare in 2020, and that would be a small subset, of course, of all the land that was sold, but that's class 9 farm. So going on to our 10th indicator, and Jake probably has more, I know he has more knowledge than me, but our last indicator has to do with solid waste and recycling. There you see the trends and where we are in the province. It almost seems like the bigger the regional district, the more there is solid waste per capita. There you see the provincial average and where the TNRD is by year, 2015 to 2019. And looking at solid waste diversion, yes, we have gone down on the diversion rate between 2016 and 2019. However, our staff has told me that the quality of the materials we're recycling has greatly improved. So the less contamination, like better quality and less contaminated or not contaminated recycling is better than the volume. And I think, have I captured that? I don't know if Jake probably has something to add there.
Yeah, that's accurate. I just want to add to that, looking at these few years of data here, the snapshot, what we want to see is less material going to landfill, obviously, and more material being recycled. And in this shorter term horizon here, we're not seeing that trend. Just want to point out a couple of major factors in that. One is the China's National Sort Initiative, which probably the board members will recall a few years ago, has greatly impacted the entire recycling world. So it made it much more difficult for all jurisdictions in North America to deal with recycling. And so that's why we've gone down the road of getting on board with Recycle BC. And because we are now source separating and increasing the quality of the actual material we're recycling, even though we have a short-term trend down in the percentages of recovery and recycling, I'm sure this is going to turn around in the longer term. And just in terms of the amount of material going to landfill, in the past, we've been as high as 1,067, I think was our peak generation per person per year. So even though we have gone up in the short term and we're up at right now at 647, we are, if you look longer term, we've actually come a long ways. So just wanted to add that in.
And that's all she wrote. If there's questions, it may be an idea to just email them. This the RGS is an ongoing thing, and I will be again bringing a report to a future committee of the whole this year if the board has an appetite to review the document itself or change any of these indicators. And at that point, I will seek your direction.
Well, thanks ever so much again, Ms. Sedilkova. As I say, your presentations are always elucidating and they're welcome. With that, I can probably entertain a motion to adjourn. We stand adjourned.
I'll move the recommendation about the report from Regina.
Oh, on Ms. Sedilkova's report? Sorry.
Second.
Okay, so all in favor? None opposed? Sounds good. Now we can stand adjourned.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, I had a, if I may, we had a long meeting. We just had another incident up on the North Thompson here with a really sadly lacking, I guess I'll use the political way of saying it, lack of maintenance on our highways that ended up causing a major crash, air ambulance, that sort of thing, just south of Little Fort. And I'm just wondering if the board would have an appetite, particularly the area directors, to possibly have a representation from MOTI at our next board meeting, just to give us an update on where we are with our winter maintenance program, because I mean, these types of things shouldn't be occurring in February. And I'm wondering if the board has an appetite to hear with, now that there's been some changes in some of the maintenance contracts and those kinds of things. I wonder if we want to have a report from them. And that also could include 5A.
We are expecting a representative from MOTI to bring us a presentation at the next board meeting, Director Stamer. The presentation was to do with the banning of commercial trucks on Highway 5A, but I would expect that he would be able to entertain questions on that same, on your topic as well. I see no reason why not. Do you, Ms. Campbell?
Nope, I think they'd be happy to answer questions about that as well.
Should we be warning him that?
I will. I'll follow up with him.
Okay. And Director Schaefer?
Director Stamer, do you not get an invitation every year about winter road maintenance from MOTI?
Invitation in which way?
To a meeting, and they describe what their winter maintenance is going to be.
I'm not aware of being invited last year for that meeting, Director Schaefer, but I can tell you right now that just from an observation in our area, it is way less than it was in previous years.
But it's a meeting that we can all question and stuff. So I'll let them put your name forward for it too.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Director Elliott, what'd you?
Well, I was just going to say, I think at one time we all did, but I haven't had one for the last at least 3 years. I don't know whether they consider our roads maintained or whether they don't. Depends on the day, I guess.